And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's great to be here with everyone. What a huge crowd already. Of course, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And wow, you you go even for a day under this new normal, and all kinds of things take place that are beyond the pale, but we're going to try to get through them. Of course, tonight's going to be a very special episode as we go deep into this continuity of government takeover that they've been rolling out under the guise of this medical health crisis of this coronavirus, which has been, really kind of pumped up quite a bit, but it did start there in January and just rolled. It's been this rolling wave. And what we found is actually, and we're going to present a lot of those findings tonight, is a lot of doctors saying that this situation is evening out on a wide scale. But it's interesting because you can be of different minds about it, as it were, as to the scale of it. But the overreach in terms of the power grab on the constitutional level, on a local level, on a state level, has just been completely beyond the pale from anything else that we've ever seen. You think of, the AIDS epidemic, you think of SARS or MERS or Ebola or any of those things. And this thing has just been, they've rolled it into this other kind of power grab they want to do. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Tonight is about the Northcom continuity of government aspect that they're setting up. And this is very interesting because they've been floating from their side this whole thing about this Terrence O'Shaughnessy, and he's a very interesting commander of Northcom. And they've been talking openly now in the media about he would be the one to take over if, for example, Pence and Trump were to get the coronavirus. And this is quite a dangerous talk and quite dangerous trial balloons that they've been floating out there. And as you know, on this show, we have been talking about continuity of government really since the start, because I've been such a huge follower of the research of Professor Peter Dale Scott, who we've had on the program many times, and who I've spent many hours of conversation with going through these various things. And Professor Scott's work is where we got the term the deep state in public. And he wrote the book Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. He wrote American Deep State, The Road to 9/11, American War Machine. I mean, these are the classics that lay out what was in development with continuity of government. And voila, they've decided to use this pretense of a health crisis to try to roll this out. Now, it's very important to stress that what we're trying to do is separate the wheat from the chaff in these reports. But largely, this is not a show about medical outcomes or if this stat is higher or if no, that what is that new malaria drug that they had so much confidence in? I think it's called chloroquine. Mm-hmm. I'm not here to debate those things with you. They can keep us debating back and forth about that stuff. The point is the rights that they're attempting to seize. And so when governors like Gavin Newsom start talking about martial law, and Andrew Cuomo starts talking about 80% of his state being infected, how does that make any sense? It's absurd. We've had, really, compared to the rest of the world, a small number of cases. I have the charts here. But they want to get us into that minutia argument. That's not where we're going. What I need to do to get the information out to you is present the foundation work around continuity of government that we've done on this show and that the professor has done to understand how they are now using those powers, which are emergency powers, to take away the Constitution and to make themselves, just the ultimate authority, and basically no one gets any rights. Under the guise of, hey, we're here to help you. That's what has been warned about for so many years. You go back to even the 60s, they had 7 Days in May, which was a movie that John F. Kennedy actually helped to get made. And it was all about this general who was played by Burt Lancaster trying to take over through a Northcom type scenario and basically fight the Russians and bypass the president. So I can tell you for a fact that they have moved into such strange footing trying to seize these emergency powers, which tells me that there's a couple of different things going on. There's a normal group that is responding in the regular way. And I call these the middle managers, the governors, the mayors, the healthcare workers. All those people are trying to do their own job, and they're just following it like they would a crisis. Something else has crept in here since this started out. And it can be debated if this was a bioweapon, if this was just a release from a lab. We've presented in the last 3 episodes those different scenarios. That's not what tonight is going to be about. Tonight is about the power grab through continuity of government and having Northcom, which is Northern Command of the United States, take over. And that's what we're looking at. And it's very close. So I need to emphasize that to not to scare you, but I've always been of the opinion that when they seize those types of powers, that they're loath to give them back, especially if it's certain groups like the ones that I'm going to go over tonight. So it's very important that we get on the same page about this. It is tempting to look at it from a number of different sides. And, there's always somebody screaming that, oh, you just have to let the government do its job. Government is not there to strip the citizens of all these rights, to strip down their economy, and to financially devastate the country without any evidence of the massive scale that they're talking about. So they've taken a particular type of medical health crisis, and they've tried to blossom it out into stealing every right under the sun. And, we've had wars over this. So they're really on very, very shaky ground. And the only thing that we can really hope is that they back off this thoroughly reckless path, which is what they're on. It's not what we're on. We were all minding our own business and trying to make a better world. But this is the nature of the situation. So we have to kind of get into that mentality. A couple of things we're going to go over tonight are instances where they've drawn up plans to do this before. That is, seize power under the guise of a crisis using the military. It's a very dangerous combination. Of course, going all the way back to 1878, Posse Comitatus, that prevented the military from acting in a law enforcement capacity. It's law on the book. You cannot overturn the law on the book on somebody's whim about what they should be happening. Now, the laws are the laws, and if there are things to go forward, the citizens will vote on them. The Constitution needs to be followed. They're acting like they've just been hit with a nuclear attack. And when you go over the number of the cases and the percentage of the cases, you're looking at what is a marginal health crisis, which they do need to address, and it's very important that we support the people in the front lines of that. But you cannot take all of the citizens' rights over a health crisis. It's not going to fly, and not in America. And, it's funny when you look at other countries, America's situation is unique. We've always been very independent. That's how we got away from Britain in the first place. And the people in Britain are not very happy with their government for the kind of draconian rules that they're laying down, not to mention France and Spain. So those countries have their own issues, and I can appreciate it. This show is American-centric in this sense, and that I'm talking about continuity of government, but the outcome affects the entire globe. So we have to kind of keep that in mind as we go along. So we're going into continuity of government and how the COG rules are to be instituted. And I'm going to reflect on the work of Peter Dale Scott. To do that, before I start off with that, Miss Olivia, how are we doing out there?
We're doing great.
Good. Yeah, it's great.
I think the energy today is very tense, and I've seen a lot of people sort of hostile with each other when it's unnecessary. And what we have to remember always is that we don't want to waste any energy fighting each other.
Right.
We all have a common enemy. And that is fascism in whatever form it presents itself. Yeah, that true. We are pro-humanity and pro-freedom, pro-liberty, and pro-freedom of expression and all of that. So I just want to encourage everybody to be self-aware and tamp it down, be polite, be civil, be kind, be generous, and
I think
be loving.
The civility thing is very important, of course. One of the things, it's very interesting because what we have going on dramatically, I would say, in the public sphere is a kind of bewilderment about the amount of rights that they've taken all at once. Now, they have a shock doctrine that is inside the military, and they use shock doctrine in order to change policy fast. A 9/11 is shock doctrine, our response to it, different things that we've done in other countries. When we look at this through the lens of them turning that back on American citizens, then we get ourselves into the right mindset for reviewing these things. Because if they're up to shock and awe with us by kind of putting in all of these very draconian measures in order to stifle the population and say, use a good reason like, oh, it's very important that you not do this because you'll contribute to the downfall of Western society and its health. It has not been proven out, and the stats and the figures do not support it by any measure or means. That does not to say it's not a health crisis. It is. So this is the nature of the thing. The other thing that they're really addicted to doing right now through the media is presenting a one-track thing. Cases skyrocketing. They said skyrocketing for Boston cases, and it was what was it like? The case load was something like 200 or something like that, or maybe not even. So that's not skyrocketing. So this is the nature of the hype that they need to paint this with. It doesn't mean that there aren't real cases, so let's get that
right.
out of the way.
And it's, this isn't like the early days of AIDS when you got it, you died. And I think there's a feeling, there's a kind of a horror and a panic that if somebody tests positive or somebody has a fever, they're going to die, right? We all have to take that down. We know someone very close to us who tested positive locally. The test was sent to the CDC for verification, came back negative, but they said quarantine anyway for the next 2 weeks. Do they have coronavirus or not? We don't know. So that's in our own lives.
We're going to mention some figures that are in the public also, like Rand Paul. And I have to say, it was one of the weirdest things to see Rand Paul test positive with this, given that his dad is such an outspoken advocate against all of these measures that they're putting in place. But let's take a look at a few of the measures. And we have to start off with what William Barr did. And I think what Barr did, and that is important, is the Attorney General, William Barr, is very closely associated with Bush 1 when he was CIA director. He goes that far back. That's 1976. And then very close to him all the way through the Reagan-Bush administration years, and then close in with W, the son. So he's a Bushite. And until recently, it's been very interesting to figure out where he was coming from. But his stance of late has been rather dramatic. And one of the things I want to point out about him is he got caught up in his own web when he has been trying to get passed in secret. And this is a very important aspect. This is the story that broke. The DOJ wants to suspend certain constitutional rights during coronavirus emergency. Now, what they want to be able to do is arrest someone and hold them indefinitely. Not try them, but hold them, maybe in a football stadium. We know that they're setting up all these football stadiums across the country. And, we see them putting beds and stuff. You're really going to keep, people in beds in Dodger Stadium? These are the types of unusual things that we've seen going on. But this was the shot across the bow, because for people who are on the fence and being like, well, they're overreacting to a crisis, but they're trying to work it out, this got us right back into 9/11 land, or worse. And when I say or worse, it's because they've moved the COG plan out. And we need to review continuity of government for those of you who haven't watched the last show. But I want to put this on the record. The Department of Justice has secretly asked Congress for the ability to detain arrested people indefinitely. Indefinite detention. That's not for some crazy terrorist. That's not for some foreign national that they're suspicious of. That's for you and me.
Why would it need to be indefinite if within 14 days, even I think 17 days is the longest it can incubate?
Well, it's not even, they're relating it to the health crisis, but they're not saying the person has to have the
But it's
virus.
completely
So, yeah,
illogical.
it is. And I'll tell you what's interesting about this is it is a move to completely remove a major section of the Constitution. When they set up the Constitution, one of the things that they were particularly unhappy with about the king was that he would target his enemies, and they would go into their homes and they would plant evidence, and then they would take them before a judge. And so all these rules that were developed that said you can take the Fifth Amendment not to incriminate yourself, that you will have legal counsel, that you will have the ability not to be searched, no search and seizure. That's a major amendment to the Constitution. That you'll have the right to gather. These are the things. And the people who set up the Constitution realized that anytime something got rolling that the king didn't like, if it was in the business area and he was like, this guy's, getting out of our control, they could just go into his house, seize him, seize his property, seize his papers. So these things were set up by constitutional government for a reason, which is the same thing that they're trying to do now they were trying to do back then. And it took a lot. It took a revolution to stop it. And, I hope it doesn't get to that. But we're not going to put up with flouting and getting rid of the Constitution, which is the foundation of the entire country. And, they could have made it up. They could have said, well, you have an asteroid coming in, we have to seize emergency powers. Or they could have had a nuclear situation. All these things would have come up. This is how it's come up. That's the nature of the beast, and we have to deal with it. And what they're trying to do is pit people against each other to fight it out for them. Oh, well, the government has to do something. They need to make more masks or whatever it is. Of course, they should make masks for people who are sick, but they should not take everyone's constitutional rights away in the meantime and say, hey, you know what? You're going to be locked down for the next 18 months. Enjoy imprisonment at home. It does not work that way. It doesn't work that way. Americans, first of all, want to see on the table what kind of medical solutions are available. We need a wide conversation of medical professionals, because a number of medical professionals have come forward and told us a different story. So I'm gonna refer to those. But one of the things that they're moving to do, and I want to thank someone out there for sending this to me. This is very interesting. Cyber infrastructure. Department of Homeland Security is handing these out to broadcast professionals or people in the media. And this is not something that has been seen, it's not around in the public sphere yet. This is an actual letter from this. They sent it on March 16th, 2020. And the letter writes, to whom it may concern, the bearer of this letter is providing emergency communications sustainment and restoration support to critical communications infrastructure facilities in response to COVID-19 declaration of national emergencies. These critical communications facilities are necessary to ensure first responder, emergency responders, public messaging, and they go down the line. The Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency's National Communications Coordination Branch requests any courtesy that can be extended to be offered to the bearer of this letter. Request support during the following date: March 16th, 2020, May 28th, 2020. Now, the state this was issued in, I believe, was Missouri. And I'm going to cut off the bottom of this here to make sure none of that is shining through. But the rest of the information, I think, is pretty clear there. That's the letter. What this means in essence is that this is your little pass. So when they shut down things along the line of communications, and that's Carolyn Goida who provided the letter, and I really very much appreciate that. And Carolyn's always doing fantastic work and sending terrific things. But this one I thought was particularly important because if you're working at a broadcast facility, if you're doing things on the media side, if you're a reporter, you're going to need your papers in order to pass these military blockades if you're going to work or if you're doing whatever it happens to be. Now, the fact that they gave this to him on March 16th and that it's good until May 28th means this is the path or the pattern that they're doing this with. Now, whether or not they'll use this is a different thing, but the fact that they're handing these out in the background, this isn't on the public radar, so they've missed this step. all of those reporters that are at CNN or that are at The Hill or Politico or any of those guys, they must be getting these too, and they're not talking. So instantly you have the media, the Homeland Security coming to them and saying, we're going to give you these passes, but don't mention it to the public because it'll create a panic or whatever. Well, too bad, I just did. And it doesn't create a panic. It gets us more informed of what's happening and what these guys are planning. I've always felt that the more that we can unravel the things that they're talking about, the better it is for us, because then they know they're on a level playing field and they won't try to lie to us like we're 5-year-old kids waiting for Santa Claus. It's very important to have a normal cycle of respect in a relationship. I think anyone would agree. And when it comes to the government's, the leadership's relationship to the citizens, that's what you're going to need to have. So we're going to bring these things forward so we get that conversation going. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. It's great to be here. This is a special high priority Sunday night broadcast. And we're talking about Northcom, continuity of government, and the plans that they have to suspend aspects of the Constitution, as on record, the Department of Justice has asked for. Now, I want to make this clear too, which is a lot of people who are, there's a lot of narratives going around in mainstream media, alternative media. It's just the nature of how it goes. But a few of them are pretty easy to dispel. One is that people who are paying attention to this are somehow overreacting to it. When you take the Constitution and you shred it in a matter of weeks over a health crisis, you're going to encounter citizens on the ground who are aware of their rights and who need a meaningful dialogue with their government. If they don't get it, you're setting yourself up for problems that Northcom ain't going to fix. So before we get into all that, it's better to have us all on a level playing field. That's important, one. Two, on the alternative side, you hear a lot of spin. And you've been hearing these fantasy stories, and I always like to boot these fantasy stories out of the ballpark immediately. One of the fantasies goes like this. Well, this is all great because now those criminals can go really to jail. And the reason that they're locking everyone up in their homes is because they're going to take all these Hollywood celebrities and they're going to take all these politicians and put them in jail. And a new system's coming in and they're going to give us free money and they're going to give us access to alternative energy and they're going to open up the UFO file and they're going to do all this. And you know what? All you have to do is sit there like a bump on a log and don't do anything. And it's all just going to come to you. Now, how often in life have things come to you like that? It's pretty rare, let's face it. I mean, it's nice.
Never.
It's nice to hit the lottery, yes. But think of that.
Trying.
Think of that as a mindset, though, right? Going in. And this is the nature of what we get. We get them in this weird thing. And you've heard all about cabal arrests. Well, I can tell you, I've got the newsletters from 2011 from people sending me that stuff. Okay. That's an 8, 9, 10-year-old meme that people have always squeezed, and I've always felt that that was an intel op, and there's a lot of marketing involved with it. There are no cabal arrests. It does not exist. There's no evidence for it anywhere. And what they're doing, as I demonstrated on this program as part of this, is actually releasing prisoners. They just released 50 prisoners from Rikers Island under the guise of a health threat. Well, they're high-risk cases, and even though they're dangerous criminals, I feel like I'm watching like the old Batman series or something where like the Joker and the Penguin and Mr. Freeze all get out at the same time. And
there is an episode like that.
Rick Mayhem on Gotham City. And this is crazy. You're going to let prisoners out of Rikers Island and say that you're protecting the public welfare? It's absurd. So we need to get, back into the mindset of they need to do what we ask them to do. If they're going to present evidence like this and say, hey, you're under pandemic panic, then you're going to have to set up a civilian council of non-bot medical professionals who can review the government's evidence against what we have on the surface with journalists. If this is how you're going to do it, if you're going to roll tanks down the street, I think this is a better alternative. Let's get some real professionals on the media side, on the medical side, to review this evidence, because the people who go into it who are sincere, and we've seen a lot of them, the media tries to shut them down, and we can see why, because they're part of whatever this is that's going on. That's why they floated this Northcom commander as the new president. I'm going to get to that right now because we need to get into the continuity of government Northcom play. This is what they're doing. And they've said it themselves. So I don't even want it to be like, this is something that I put together just based on they said it. They put, Newsweek is one of their biggest mouthpieces along with the Washington Post. So if they're getting into this, we're going to review who they're talking about. The nice thing is our listeners have a good foundation on continuity of government. And all those interviews with Professor Scott are right there for free on my channel. If you go to darkjournalist.com and click on Deep Politics or Deep State, his interviews are there. And his books are incredible. I mean, Professor Scott, I should explain briefly, is a former Canadian diplomat who is a UC Berkeley professor. He's written multiple books now. I think he must have written over a dozen books dealing with this political deep state aspect. And, in that realm of writers like Seymour Hersh and others who tackle the CIA side, Professor Scott always went deeper. And instead of being like a Bob Woodward and getting some truth out but cozying up to CIA elements, he actually decided, I'm going to dive in and get the real truth. And something about that really has made him untouchable as far as the media and other things are concerned. However, anyone who knows anything about deep state research understands that Professor Scott's work is the gold standard. I mean, he's the foundation. And many of the ideas are grabbed or bastardized or whatever it happens to be, but nonetheless, it's his work that gives us so much of a foundation, and it's a large-scale foundation of dark journalism for sure, because I've been reading him since I was in my 20s. So it's been one of those things where that's an understanding of part of the world I've got from his work. I want to read something that he wrote and then explain how emergency powers work and how constitutional authority is usurped by these powers and how they can be misused, and how it's always, even if it in the original kind of outline of how the country should work, once we got into the nuclear age, when they set up continuity of government, they still envisioned the continuity of government as the ultimate last resort for anything. And it was basically if a nuke hit the White House and it got the president and the vice president. That's the kind of emergency they were talking about. They weren't talking about a health crisis with differing opinions. It was a totally different situation that they were set up for, and that's a crucial difference, I think, to make. So let me quote a few things here from Professor Scott's book. This book is called The Road to 9/11, Wealth, Empire, and the Future of America. And this was his real dissecting of what was going on in the background. Now, I'm going to read just from this page, which is Parallel Structures and Plans for Continuity of Government, COG. We all need to get COG into our lexicon. If you watch this show, you hear it enough, but we all need to understand that these are the rules that they're laying down. So when we hear about them seizing this, or the Defense Production Act, or, having to go through military curfew or things, it's all continuity of government. The entire plan is just sitting there waiting and very easily abused. Okay. This chapter, and especially the next, explore the consequences of this arresting coincidence that the COG planning team of the 1980s was essentially reconstituted by Bush the Younger in May 2001 as a terrorism task force before 9/11. And then after, planning activities of which we know next to nothing about, a major attack on the United States of which we also know next to nothing, resulted in implementation of COG. The public also knows next to nothing about COG, except that its powers to disrupt constitutional government are considerable. Continuity of government is a reassuring title. It would be more honest, however, to call it a change of government plan, since according to Alfonso Chardy of the Miami Herald, the plan called for suspension of the Constitution, that is, turning control of the government over to FEMA. Emergency appointment of military commanders. Remember, we talked about military governors. Emergency appointment of military commanders to run state and local governments and declaration of martial law, like Gavin Newsom tried to roll out in California a few days ago, saying there were 25 million cases in his state, which is beyond crazy and incredible. We don't even, I mean, the numbers are absurd. But he wanted to do it because he wanted to announce martial law. I'll go back and read that. Emergency appointment of military commanders to run state and local governments and declaration of martial law during a national crisis. Coronavirus. The plan also gave the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which had been involved in drafting it, sweeping new powers, including internment. This is important. Now, they've just asked through the DOJ for internment because they want to be able to arrest someone and detain them without trial. That's internment. I can keep you somewhere, I can grab you, and then deal with you later when I feel like it. That is a Nazi tactic, and that is the nature of a totalitarian regime. It's not American. I mean, this is not American. The team was planning, in effect, for the supplanting in a major crisis of the public state by an alternative one. According to author and journalist James Mand, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney were principal actors in one of the most highly classified programs of the Reagan administration. You see how far back this goes? This type of planning. Under its U.S. officials carried out detailed planning exercises for keeping the federal government running during and after a nuclear war with the Soviet Union, with the Russians. The program called for setting aside the legal rules for presidential succession in some circumstances. This is key when we read the Newsweek article. Again, the program called for setting aside legal rules for presidential succession in some circumstances.
Wait a second. You set aside legal rules?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Now, legal rules for presidential succession in favor of a secret procedure for putting in place a new president and his staff. Think about that.
This is a coup.
It is. The idea was to concentrate on speed, to preserve continuity of government, and to avoid cumbersome procedures. The Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, and the rest of the Congress would play a greatly diminished role. Yeah, because when you seize power and you have a dictator, those guys go under. The planning eventually called for the suspension of the Constitution, not just after a nuclear war, but for any national security emergency. This is crucial. This is the rule that they changed, that they can use COG now, because this is not a nuclear event, but they're making it a national emergency, even though it does not rise to that. It's a health crisis for sure, but it does not rise to the level of a national emergency. Yes, let me finish this real quick. That was defined in executive order. Now get it ready, because it's on the books. This is not some, Q fantasy or something else. This is on the books. You can read it. Executive Order 12656 of 1988, quote, any occurrence, including natural disaster, military attack, technological emergency, that's interesting, or other emergency that's serious, or other emergency, we're in the other emergency, that seriously degrades or seriously threatens the national security of the United States. Finally, COG planning was eventually integrated into planning by a number of groups corresponding to different departments dealing with different functions. One group, the Continuity of Government Interagency Group, there's layers. COG Interagency Group dealt with the devolution and relocation of government leaders to prevent decapitation of the government in a crisis. Another group dealt with command and control problems to ensure security for communications and computers so that decisions could be made and implemented. Another group focused on the Department of Defense plan for retaliation against the nation's attackers. Now, here's where we're going to be able to fit the pieces together with the Newsweek article for what I just wrote, what I just read to you that Professor Scott wrote. Basically, the bullet points there are continuity of government was planned originally during the Eisenhower administration. It was planned and set up as an underground covert government in case the overt government, the president, the vice president, the Speaker of the House, the Congress, were not able to perform their duties in the event of a nuclear attack. It's pretty good planning. It had a good reason when it was first set up. In the 80s, it was reopened by the likes of George Herbert Walker Bush, vice president, Oliver North, guilty of crimes in the Iran-Contra affair, and a series of players, including Donald Rumsfeld, who at the time was the head of a prescription drug pharmaceutical company, who created aspartame, which gave everybody cancer. They took it off the market. And he wasn't even in government when he was working on this, but he had previously been Secretary of State Secretary of Defense under President Ford, and then his chief of staff. And also Dick Cheney had worked for Ford. So these guys have been around for a long time. They set this, they set it in motion and put this on the ground. So in the 80s, when Reagan, after he had been shot and after he showed signs maybe of Alzheimer's late in his administration, like 87, 88, they had these meetings with him and they were saying, look, in the event that it's not just a nuclear emergency, if something else happens, help us change this rule. And they got him to do it. So he went along with it. But it was Rumsfeld and Cheney who, along with Ollie North and Bush, who put this whole thing together. This is a fascist plan for taking over the government. Now, by the time 9/11 hit, they did exercise the rules. And there were a lot of things around 9/11 that made it appear like they had indefinite detention in it. You know, they had this whole thing about these terrorists are going to get you, and they were using the same type of scare tactics, like playing these weird bin Laden videos on TV every night. So they moved into that, but because they were back, baby, they were back. They had been around in 1976 under Ford, in very high positions. Then Defense Secretary under Bush 1, Cheney, Rumsfeld, he had gone out of government completely and he came back. Bush 2, W, selected him as defense secretary, so he ended up being the youngest and the oldest defense secretary until recently. So this is interesting because those guys were back and they utilized the 9/11 event to move COG into they actualized it. They had used it, and they set up something called the 9/11 emergency, which still every president has to sign, which suspends some aspects of the Constitution by allowing Northcom to surveil and take a larger role in the activities of the mainland. Northcom was never meant to do that. So we actually have an army base now that is running things. And Northcom is very interesting. I'm going to get into the details of how that works. But basically now we see the setup of all of these forces coming in. And inside of that version of COG, they went ahead and said, no legal process for selecting the president, no vital role for the Speaker of the House, etc., for when they implemented that. And they changed it out of the nuclear side to just be for any emergency, which they're trying to turn Corona into this emergency. And it does not meet the test at all. So this is very crucial. I think these facts are important because they're on the ground. This isn't anybody's guess. These are legal documents. These are processes that are set up. Now, there's still a lot about COG that we don't know. But suddenly, in the middle of this, Newsweek magazine started to tout it. Now, I'm going to read that, but before I do, how are we doing out there?
We're doing great. I do have a couple questions for you.
Sure.
So the Philip K. Dick Film Festival is asking, who is executing the coup? If Trump is for this is not a deep state coup. Trump will fight this nonsense unless he is a part of it.
Yeah, it's very tricky. See, the thing is, it's not for us to think that Trump's in there heroically fighting it, and it's not for us to think that he's a big part of it. I think it's more important is that there's a process taking place. So let's suppose you had a government that was working on this health crisis, and this thing did come out of a Chinese lab. Professor Scott, in his deep state work, talks about piggybacking. Piggybacking is when an element that's in that covert state, deep black op players inside of the deep state. And we have to explain what that is too, because it's been bastardized a lot in mainstream and alternative media. We have to go back to the central definitions that Professor Scott laid out, because that's where this framework comes from for understanding those things, and a lot of others too. But I think we need to get out of the, the deep state is just, it's like cabal. It's too easy. That doesn't mean anything. The deep state has a real foundation. Professor Scott spent 4 decades spelling it out for what it is for us. So we have to be able to observe it that way. But fundamentally, the idea of President Trump being a good guy or a bad guy kind of doesn't matter. Because those forces, it's like trying to track a mafia war. That's one thing. But let's say they're up there and they're working through all this, and they come up with this health crisis and they're working on it. This other thing comes in and piggybacks on top of all these operations and starts putting pressure by using its assets in the media, making this into a larger and larger spectacle. We note that in the last episode, we talked so much about the Imperial College estimate of the situation versus previous estimates, which were much more contained. And Imperial College freaked everyone out, including Boris Johnson and the Trump administration. And they were the ones who said, we have to, make sure nobody goes anywhere for 18 months in this whole thing, which is not true. And we already have people in Hong Kong going back to work. Okay, so the way that they're presenting this is inaccurate. I think we've proved that. But the question is, what is the nature of this thing that is piggybacking on top of this health crisis to try to force us over the cliff? And that's the thing that we need to get at, not to discuss numbers like, well, actually, there are 600 cases over here. No, there's only 200 because of the way they're reporting them. Look, this is the truth. If you look into it, the more that people have applied rigorous research to it, all the numbers go down. Even the CDC admitted that. And one of the big numbers that came out was in a medical journal, and this is something that Cheryl Atkinson got into. She's a former CBS News reporter. A medical journal reported last week that people under 20 were getting it at this ridiculous rate, like close to 20%. And then the day later, they said, we made a mistake. But all those news outlets had picked up this ridiculous story, and we were living under that fault. That's fake news. And these people had to come forward and say, we made a mistake. But there was no...
Retractions never get any attention.
Exactly. Washington Post, New York Times, they just ran with those numbers. Because their big thing is, hey, we haven't been able to scare the young people with this yet.
Yeah,
right?
I think it's really important to acknowledge that this is whatever is going on. It's very serious, and people are dying. So this is a serious lung infection. And we don't want to minimize that.
No, we haven't. As a matter of fact,
so let's just be clear about that.
No, there's no. What's interesting is, just like the flu is a major health issue, and AIDS was a major health issue, and I was looking up stats for drug addiction. There were 72,000 drug overdoses in 2017. That's an opioid crisis. So we have a number of different crises. The question is not the crises or minimizing the crises. The question is the suspension of constitutional rights and the level that you need to meet to do that. The way it was set up originally, as I said, was nuclear. And then some of these rules got changed, and now they want to be able to create the emergency to institute the continuity of government rules. Those are the facts on the ground. It's something that they now are openly talking about. This is why I think it's so serious. Look, however you want to look at this, if you want to say, it's the epidemic of the future, the Department of Justice, William Barr, Attorney General, Bushite since 1975, just asked in closed doors, Congress, the Supreme Court, and others, to suspend habeas corpus, to suspend normal procedure so that they could indefinitely detain United States citizens. You're never, ever going to be able to do that. I don't know what you thought you were thinking. That is the most unconstitutional thing I can think of. Those alternative groups out there who are thinking, that are infested thoroughly with these memes from intel companies or marketing companies saying that Barr is some white hat who's going to arrest, degenerate senators. It's a joke. He just asked for these powers in secret. We wouldn't even know except that it leaked out. So he's looking to arrest you, to grab me, you, or anyone that doesn't agree with the corona thing, name them a threat, throw them in a stadium and let them hang out there, basically, and hunger and thirst until they've learned their lesson, right? That's the way that those rules work. That's how despotism works. Those are the things you're looking at. Look, they're close. This is not a drill. Like, they are close to moving in with the military to suspend the Constitution. It's not a lie. And I don't think that it has to go that way. And I don't think that that's fear-mongering. And like I said, there's a lot of people caught up in the middle, like governors, mayors, county managers, healthcare workers, and we have to do our best to support them. And, follow along with what they say if they're trying to get people not to be out and not to have gatherings of 250 people. Fine, you go along with it to a certain degree to see what kind of numbers and stats they can change and help with the health crisis. But you do not surrender your rights wholesale to them. Not in America, you don't. So we're under the Constitution. And if you're going to alter the Constitution, you're going to have a better reason. That's that simple. So let's get into now how this article came about and who they were pumping up as the president that they were going to slip in via COG. Not Trump, not Biden, not Bernie, but Terry O'Shaughnessy. General Terrence J. O'Shaughnessy. You probably never heard of him. He's the commander of Northcom. He's a 4-star general. One of the things I want to point out about him is this is a picture of him in 2015. And it is Obama meeting one of the survivors of Pearl Harbor, original. And there we can see that the job that he had before taking on the job of Northcom commander was as the commander of forces in the Pacific Theater. So he has quite a track record, and he's in his 50s, and he's actually born in Canada. So there's a lot of interesting things
that's illegal, isn't it? Sort of.
Oh, well, the president.
If he was the real president?
Oh, yeah, the president has to be born in America.
Mm-hmm.
There's no question about that. He has to be an American citizen born in America, which is why, like, Arnold Schwarzenegger, for example, couldn't run for president. But interestingly enough, if he was installed, however, and since they had suspended the Constitution, they can just roll it in, apparently. I'm sure that O'Shaughnessy is, he's a good general, and he's done all these things in his own life that are very commendable. This has nothing to do with slighting General O'Shaughnessy. What I'm trying to do is get to why they were pumping him up through Newsweek magazine as the future leader of the country. Let's get to that. There's only one thing in reviewing and doing research on the general that bothered me, which is he seems to never use the word the United States. It's always homeland. He talks about we're going to protect the homeland from threats and homeland this and homeland that. Look, homeland is not the United States. It's not the Homeland Constitution. It's the United States Constitution. We are the United States of America. We're not homeland. If you call it homeland, you can ascribe anything to that name, including the fact that the military took over and runs the show. The United States of America has a different connotation. When you say that, everyone knows there's a constitution that backs the United States of America. So if you have problems and you're a general saying the United States of America, I read multiple interviews, and it was always homeland with him. I find that strange.
It's so weird that you couldn't find him saying United States once.
Well, not
He's
so
a
far.
general.
Not
I mean,
so
maybe he
far.
does, but you looked and you couldn't find it.
I've been pretty deep in there. Look, here's a good example. Okay, this is just a snapshot from an interview with the Department of Defense magazine, and that is the general there, Terrence O'Shaughnessy, who, like I said, does a great job as a general, I'm sure. However, I don't want him installed in a coup as president. Fair enough. All right. Question. What does the overarching guidance of the Department of Defense, DoD, state about homeland defense and your command's role within it? General O'Shaughnessy. During my career, I have never seen the guidance as clear and vertically aligned as it is today. We start with the national security strategy, and its number one pillar is the responsibility to protect the American people, the homeland, and the American way of life. We then go to National Defense Strategy, NDS. Objective number one, defending the homeland. I'm looking for the United States here. We have this clarity in what we're supposed to be prioritizing, which again for us is homeland defense, the defense of the United States, right? You would think so. We next look at the concept of joint operations, Joint Force 2030, which talks about how we need to integrate forward presence and ensure power protection with increased protection to the homeland, and to create that depth to deter and defeat strategic attacks on the homeland. It's important to clarify that it's not an either-or situation. It's integration and it's complementary. We need both to defend the homeland and push forward as much as possible. So he had, in all that, he mentioned homeland 7 times, but he did not mention the United States once. That's a little bit troubling.
It's weird.
Well, when you're around things like Northcom and NORAD and all that stuff, you're dealing with, they can deal with Canada and the United States, but they don't call, that's using homeland security again. It takes away the idea of the United States. That's what's wrong with the Department of Homeland Security, which, by the way, works in concert with, but is not a part of Northcom. They're different. They're separate things. And Northcom, which we're going to get into, wasn't even developed until 2002. We didn't have it. They developed it after 9/11, after the implementation of continuity of government. He is now the person who is the Northcom commander. That's the person who gets installed in the case of continuity of government. Not the vice president, not the Speaker of the House. It assumes that all those functions of the president and vice president get moved over to this person. So that's an important thing for us to kind of start to meander on and look on and say, let's ponder this for a minute. Now, here's another thing when we look at this, which I think is crucial, which is this guy, you could say, well, he's great. He's the commander of Northcom, and, they won't be doing that. They're not going to do that. And that's just something that Dark Journalist thinks because he read a lot of Peter Dale Scott about continuity of government. All right. Newsweek magazine, which is known as the mouthpiece of the establishment and the trial balloon center, just like the Washington Post, which has been run by the CIA since the 50s. Their article now from March 18th, exclusive, inside the military's top secret plans if coronavirus cripples the government. And they go through, how this would occur. They say, even as President Trump since he tested negative for coronavirus, the COVID-19 pandemic raises the fear that huge swaths of the executive branch or even Congress and the Supreme Court could also be disabled, forcing the implementation of continuity of government. March 18th, Newsweek. They're talking about. Okay, let's go further. Continuity of government plans that include evacuating Washington and devolving leadership to second-tier officials in remote and quarantined locations. But coronavirus is also new territory where the military itself is vulnerable and the disaster scenarios being contemplated, including the possibility of widespread domestic violence. Well, maybe you shouldn't let so many prisoners out, for starters. as a result of food shortages. Well, they keep guaranteeing us that we have enough food, so that's interesting. Are forcing planners to look at what are called extraordinary circumstances. Extraordinary circumstances demand extraordinary power grabs, apparently. Above top secret contingency plans already exist for what the military is supposed to do if all the constitutional successors are incapacitated. Standby orders were issued more than 3 weeks ago to ready these plans. The plans have been readied 3 weeks ago. So 3 weeks, which is 21 days before March 18th, was February 26th. This is going to be kind of important as we go along here. Standby orders were issued more than 3 weeks ago to ready these plans, not just to protect Washington, but also to prepare for the possibility of some form of martial law. Hey, some form is okay. If you don't say martial law straight up, some form is kind of like the nice way
Softens
to put
it a little bit.
According to new documents and interviews with military experts, various plans, they run through the code names. I'm not even going to mention what the code names are. Just stick with COG. Are the underground laws, they call them Octagon, Freejack, and Zodiac. Let's just say COG because they want people to go nuts and confuse that situation. The various plans, codenamed Octagon, Freejack, and Zodiac, are the underground laws to ensure government continuity. They are so secret that until these extraordinary plans, devolution could circumvent the normal constitutional provisions for government succession, and military commanders could be placed in control around America. We're in new territory, says one senior officer. The entire post-9/11 paradigm of emergency planning is thrown out the window, the officer jokes, in a kind of morbid humor characteristic of this slow-moving disaster. The officer jokes that America had better learn who General Terence J. O'Shaughnessy is. Like I said, most people have never heard of him. But Newsweek wanted to put him front and center because he's the commander of Northcom. And in the original plans drawn up by Cheney and Rumsfeld for continuity of government planning, they were looking to figure out who to install, and they created Northcom, and then he becomes the base commander of Northcom who gets to come in and invoke the COG rules. This is just how it goes. That's why they're mentioning him. He is the, quote, combatant commander of the United States and would, in theory, be in charge if Washington were eviscerated. That is, until a new civilian leader could be installed. Yeah. Like after Hitler seized power during the Reichstag fire and was so interested in having elections after that. We're in territory we've never been in before. So that means because we're in weird territory, give up the Constitution, give up your rights, and let a small group of military officials and deep staters run the country. No. Okay, so what happens, government expert Norman Ornstein asked last week, if so many members of Congress come down with coronavirus that the legislature cannot meet or cannot muster a quorum? After 9/11, Ornstein and others, alarmed by how little Washington had prepared for such possibilities, created a bipartisan continuity of government commission to examine precisely these and other possibilities. Now, here's the thing. The continuity of government rules, like I said, have been in effect since the Eisenhower administration. They were greatly expanded during the Reagan administration, and the nuclear aspect was removed, and just any emergency was good enough. Those rules of continuity of government were exercised during the 9/11 emergency, and that's how they were able to roll in things like emergency powers, and how every president has to sign that, warrantless wiretap thing, which violates the Constitution. Okay, so there's a lot of different places that article goes to, but I think I've made the point, and I highly recommend it as a good read. What they're trying to do is introduce the idea that Terry O'Shaughnessy can take over if President Trump and Pence get sick with coronavirus, that we're in such a mess, and you know what, there's so many military tanks and soldiers everywhere anyway, you might as well just have this guy as your new president. And he can command them because he's a military commander. And don't worry, eventually he'll relinquish power and you'll have a civilian government again. So continuity of government planning was set up by people who do not think constitutionally. They think from a deep state point of view in a fascist sense. And their influences are fascist, but they haven't been able to figure out how to get Americans into a space where they can seize those types of martial powers. But they've been looking for that opportunity. Even if you go through Kissinger's work and background, this has come up over and over again. And we've seen at times, like during 9/11, and there have been certain crises where this has come about. The Central Intelligence Agency, in their activities, have suspended any kind of obedience to the Constitution. And that's why we found ourselves in a mess in so many different countries, or taking out world leaders and things like that. So while they're moving this situation around on one hand and closing in on us, they're also doing things like promoting war with Iran and these other distractions, which are terrible ideas. So that we may accept them, and everything becomes a military idea now. Now, the military is a fantastic thing for us to utilize, and we need a strong military and all the rest of it. That has nothing to do with this. This is the misuse of the military, and it is the rogue installation of a command unit to run the government. I mean, can you imagine anything more bizarre? That's how you get mass revolutions, is when governments try things like this, and those governments usually get thrown out, and if they're successful, they go down as totalitarian dictatorships. And America's not supposed to be a banana republic, so hopefully we turn this kind of situation around. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep on Meet the New Boss, General Terence O'Shaughnessy. Now, we're going to be taking questions in the second part of the program, and I want you to ask them all in caps, because Miss Olivia is going to be putting those together for us. How are you doing out there?
Good. I think we all need to take a little breath for a second. This is it's pretty oppressive, this information. It's hard to take it all in, because it you wind up being paralyzed, emotionally. So at least I'm holding my breath, literally, listening to you. So let's just breathe. Okay, I do have a question for you.
Yes.
Are you bringing up at all the 2010 Rockefeller Foundation exercise?
I will. I'll mention that in the question section, if you can remember that. And also, there's so many interesting aspects around this. I'm going to stick to O'Shaughnessy for this next segment to try to get a handle on who they're trying to install. And I think that's pretty important as well. I want to remind everyone to go to darkjournalist.com to sign up for a newsletter. We've been seeing so many voices thrown off social media and YouTube. And one of the things that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has laid out there is that, any kind of dissenting voice could be the Russians or the Chinese or the Iranians with misinformation. So, we need to do a crackdown on that. Well, I'm sure part of that crackdown is people who don't agree with their plan, like Dark Journalist and so many others. That what we need to do is make sure that we have that pipeline together. And one of the things that's so good about being part of the newsletter is we just tell you once a week what's going to come up. There's no marketing. There's no, you basically get it on every Friday, when we usually do shows Friday at 8 p.m. The schedule's been a little strange lately with everything that's going on. But that's the way to really guarantee that you're getting this back and forth with us directly. So go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the free newsletter, and we'll keep you up to date on all the different things that are going on. I do feel that this is much more than a health crisis. It's a constitutional crisis. It's cascading there fast. And they're trying to incline the governors towards martial law. And again, this force is piggybacking on top of the actual health crisis that's taking place and exaggerating its proportions in order to make it a nuclear-style event so they can seize power. We need to stop them from doing that by voicing it. While we have the tools, remember, Cyber Command and so many of these other pieces are part of this. And if they feel that they have you silenced and not checking into their activities and doing pushback, they could pull the plug on the internet. And then where would we be then? Then that's just confusion in the National Guard. I mean, it's a bizarre scenario that they've moved us into. And, there are scenarios where they say this would end quicker, and I would hope that they would do that. It's not about not cooperating with the middle managers and the authorities and things. And it's not about, people being holed up in their places with guns and, a survivalist thing. I feel like anyone has the right to handle it, the way that they see fit. What I'm trying to get at is it's important to restore balance to the strategic situation on the ground. If you're going to roll tanks, if you're going to violate Posse Comitatus, if you're going to try to remove the president, as this article was a trial balloon for, then we're going to create the dialogue now, and it are the people in this chat and the ideas from here and in this conversation are going to be part of that, moving that conversation out and really letting them know that we're not going to accept a totalitarian state overnight, a turnkey totalitarian state where they make the rules and tell us how dangerous the emergency is. I'm sure that we need a civilian commission made up of experts of our own, military and medical and political experts who can interface with the government during this period, because this idea of the government and its subjects is like how we got the revolution in America in the first place, because we didn't want the crown running the show here. That's why, because they were oppressive, they were testing and taxing their subjects. The king was very jealous of power. They try to enslave and throw their enemies in jail. That's where we get all these rights from. So we're not going to lose that battle overnight because someone's screaming virus. We can still deal with the medical health emergency with the resources of this country and, maintain the constitutional rule. If you don't, if you turn all of these things over to a small group, including political power, financial power, the economy, the courts, William Barr asking to be able to detain people and them setting up big football fields. I mean, what they've done is they're making everyone's kind of paranoid fantasy come true because they're showing the real face. This is how they want to do it. Whoever this group is that's running the real COG wave, this is the group. And it's hard to pinpoint that deep state, but we know when they move. And this is why the work of people like Professor Peter Dale Scott is so crucial, because it helps us to understand those forces and to retake the natural authority the citizens have in times of crisis. It's not to say that we shouldn't cooperate with the government, local officials, health officials. Those things should always, we should always be willing to do those things. But this is crazy. This is an insanity, and it'll get worse if that dialogue and pushback doesn't happen. So that's what we're doing tonight. We're getting deep into it. It's great to have so many people here with us. And I have to say, I've been seeing a lot more people come forward, and that's been good, actually. Haven't you gotten that sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me. And we've got some great people. We're going to be taking questions in the second part. I want to get a snapshot of O'Shaughnessy going, because it's very interesting to me that they selected him for those. And again, if they decide to pack up their op and that they got enough data from us and how we would react, then no one would be happier than me for them to do that. But nonetheless, I'm not going to sit by and watch them shred the Constitution under the guise of a health emergency. I mean, no good, honest reporter would do it. Okay, I wanted to point this out. Just before, Hitler was sort of opening up concentration camps and storming around with uniforms and really doing the heavy, heavy duty dictatorship. You know, he was walking around as a normal politician with a suit and stuff. He was trying to be part of that government, and he was looking for his opportunity to seize power. And it was very interesting because that opportunity came about and is known as the original false flag, which is something called the Reichstag fire, where they took this kind of important political historical building and burnt it to the ground and then blamed it on the communists and said, we can't have this inclusive government, and we need to seize these emergency powers. Once they seized those emergency powers, they went for another move, which was the Enabling Act of 1933. It just so happens that Hitler, when he got this passed, tomorrow is actually the anniversary, March 23rd, 1933. So what do we figure that was, 87 years ago?
Yep.
I'm going to read about this Enabling Act of 1933, and it's chilling how similar the whole thing is. The Enabling Act, formerly titled The Law to Remedy the Distress of People and Reich, was an amendment to the Weimar Constitution that gave the German cabinet, in effect, the Chancellor, who was Hitler, the power to enact laws without the involvement of the Reichstag, that is, the citizens' representatives in government. The Enabling Act gave Hitler powers and followed on the heels of the Reichstag fire decree, which had abolished most civil liberties and transferred state powers to the Reich government. Now remember, they had their emergency there, and everyone ran around saying, well, the communists are burning government buildings. What can we do? Give Hitler the power. He'll restore order. You see, it sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? This combined effect of the two laws was to transform Hitler's government into a legal dictatorship. That was 1933. Think of the hell of 12 years before 1945 and the final defeat of Hitler after the deaths of millions of people. Really understand what the stakes are when you surrender your rights during an emergency. The act passed both the Reichstag and the Reichsrat on March 23, 1933, and was signed by President Paul von Hindenburg later that day. And the presidency and Hindenburg was largely formality. Hindenburg was in his 80s and he died shortly afterwards. I wonder how that was arranged. The act stated that it was to last 4 years unless renewed by the Reichstag, which it did. They just kept renewing it every 4 years and he got to be dictator. So originally they were like, no, just 4 years and then everything will be back to normal. We've been hearing a lot.
That's how they get away with it.
Yes. Well, you notice how
they say it's temporary,
yes,
but it just goes on forever.
Well, this crisis went from, hey, it'll be over in 3 weeks. So, 6 to 10 weeks. Well, I'll tell you what, 18 months sounds better. Let's go for that. And by the way, they've been sending out a lot of trial balloons on this. So we need to really stay on top of it. And the more we stay on top of it, the more we talk about it, the more we push it out there, the less likely it is to happen. That's the thing. But if people are lying down on the job and saying, oh, please send me a check and some canned goods, and here's my constitutional rights, then you're going to have a real problem because the group that's in charge of pushing this is giving themselves incredible latitude in a very short period of time. So if it's part of shock doctrine, then the best thing to do is to let them know that we're aware of it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep now in Northcom, continuity of government rules. And this is really America under COG, what it would look like. And this is where they're going to. We're going to be taking your questions shortly. How are you doing out there?
Good. I wanted to add that not only is this tomorrow is the 87th anniversary, or is it today? It's tomorrow. Today,
23rd, yeah.
I heard it's the 40th anniversary of the Georgia Guidestones.
Yes.
And yesterday was the 40th anniversary of Skull and Bones.
All right. Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Although I wonder about that because the 322 actually does not relate to a date. So maybe they
We'll
just
have to double
that.
check. Somebody said it in the ideas.
How about
so
that?
Interesting.
Well, 322 has always been weird what they were talking about with Skull and Bones and 322, but apparently it relates to the Greeks I guess that's for another show.
So Kat Goida also said,
yes.
domestic and foreign fascists won World War II, as well as November 22, 1963. Is this the Fourth Reich coming out of the closet now?
Well, Kat knows a lot about these things. She's studied and she's done her own blog work and historical work, and she knows a lot about this. So I think we both know that the danger exists for them to install. I mean, they're talking about it openly. And so, they have this idea of, hey, the benevolent military with this benevolent Northcom commander will be installed for continuity of government. And this idea that they would, have Trump get corona or whatever. I mean, this is what they're floating out there. It's not something that we're thinking of. So there always is the danger in a situation like this of the military taking over and with the citizens under the guise of an emergency. We've seen it play out over and over in history, and that's why we need to stop it at this level while we still have a microphone. Yes.
Okay. The C Noble says C equals 3, V equals 22. Coronavirus. I just putting it out there.
There's so many. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of very interesting numerology, shall we say, around this. So let's get into this a little bit. I'm going to read just a little tiny bit more about this. After being appointed Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933, Hitler asked President von Hindenburg to dissolve the Reichstag. A general election was scheduled for March 5th, 1933. A secret meeting was held between Hitler and 20 to 25 industrialists at the official residence of Hermann Göring of the Reichstag presidential palace, aimed at financing the election campaign of the Nazi Party. So a lot of these things came about. It was like in the background, there were these things going on. And then when the fire happened, they rolled Hitler out, and he was in a suit and he was concerned, and, just like, and you wouldn't think, hey, like less than a year later, this guy's going to be screaming his head off in a military uniform, asking everyone to agree with him or go to concentration camps. But this is the problem of placing too much authority in one place. America has a fantastic heritage of freedom and democracy, and that's what we need to stick with. When they ask us to go against that and try to suspend things for emergency purposes and seize emergency powers, then we have to go into overdrive to protect our rights. And as we've seen with the Department of Justice, they want to hold people, you, me, our relatives, our friends, our family, in jail if they just feel like it. And if they don't want to give us trials, and they don't want to, and they want to do this secretly. They want to get the secret powers to do this. So now it's out. So now what do you think? I mean, that kind of changes things a little bit, huh? It does.
I don't think enough people have studied the Nazis, to be honest with you.
It's true.
Really. And, but you don't even have to go back that far. I will say again, Aaron Russo, watch that video. Because it's
Aaron
very
Russo was
enlightening.
fantastic. He was
well,
he was an upstart politician. He'd been a producer in Hollywood. He produced The Rose and Trading Places. Yeah, amazing.
One of the best comedies of all time.
But he figured out the financial thing and the political thing pretty quickly, and he started an independent party in the 90s. One of the interesting things about him is that Nicholas Rockefeller became very fond of him, and Russo ran for governor in Nevada and as an independent, and Nicholas Rockefeller was very fascinated with this whole thing, and so they got to be friends and hang out, and he would say things to him like, why do you care so much about these slaves? And then he told him the whole setup about 9/11, and he told him it was going to happen, but this was like in 1993, 94. And he said, they're going to be looking through caves looking for these terrorists, and they won't be able to find them. And so he laid out this rather heavy-duty scenario. And then he said the whole point was that they wanted to be able to chip people to track them. And they wanted all their currency and all their exchanges to be through that chip. Now, when Russo said it at the time, a lot of people.
It's not just that. It's a one world government.
Yes.
With ultimate control.
Yeah.
And they can the important thing is they can just turn off your chip anytime they want. So there's no dissent anymore.
Yeah, right. So if you got yourself into a dissident position, and we've seen this with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. Now, one of the things I want us to do a lot of kind of retro balancing of this situation too. Let's look back to last year and think about them grabbing Assange and then putting him in this maximum security situation. Now let's relate it to what's taken place. If this was anticipated, if it was arranged, getting someone like Assange out of the picture would be crucial. And because he would be getting that kind of intel in the background on these things, and it might have undone the entire operation. So getting him sort of, tortured face down in a prison was crucial. And I have to say that when we look at the broad sweep of how they've thrown people off social media and how they removed those dissenting voices and came up with things like, oh, that's hate speech, or for the safety of our community, we can't have a differing view. It was funny. A lot of people on the left originally were looking at this and saying, good, I'm glad they threw off some of those right-wing whack jobs or whatever. And then it started to happen to their own heroes, because there's a certain left that this establishment doesn't like either. And so that deep state force was just as happy to silence people on the right and the left. They only want this kind of strange narrative of transhumanism and militarism. And even the liberals and the Democrats started calling, Rachel Maddow was on TV every night, like, the Russians, we need to face on their nuclear arsenal, advocating war with Russia, which was absurd. Look, Russia spends on the military in a year what we spend in a week. That's the fact. So let's get real. You always keep an eye on threats and things like that, but we've been surrounding these countries like Iran, like Russia, that, we're not under any military threat from those countries. You might have a whack job in North Korea who has weapons there, but again, he seems to use them just to get money and international praise or acclaim. So, I do not see the need for close to $1 trillion budget signed off on. We're not at active war. And this is the nature of a big part of the problem. So with that in mind, let's look at this O'Shaughnessy who commands Northcom and is a real kind of hardcore guy. And let's look at the emergency powers and COG in action. And then we'll look at the media normalization of losing our rights and how all these things work together. And if they're planning to push this now, or they're data collecting, however it is, we have to speak up about it now and make sure that we do that kind of reporting. Okay, O'Shaughnessy, Terrence John O'Shaughnessy. There he is at Northcom. I was thinking maybe this guy's his VP. Is already choosing.
He looks like Robin, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. Terrence John O'Shaughnessy was born in 1964, so he's 56, and he was born in North Bay, Ontario, Canada. He's not a United States, not a natural-born United States citizen. He's certainly a citizen now. And he's a four-star general who currently serves as commander of Northcom, and he's the commander of North American Aerospace Defense Command. This is crucial, too, because there's a whole aerospace side to this guy, which when we get into the Space Force, you wonder sometimes if they didn't sucker Trump into passing the Space Force and then move him out of the way and have this guy installed as space commander and local president, right? Mm-hmm. That's the way they do it. So his, oddly enough, they relocated to Framingham, Massachusetts, which would you say it's about a half hour from here?
Yep.
And that's where he grew up and that's where he lived. And he went to Air Force Academy, and there's a series of places that he showed up. The United States Air Force Academy, he commanded a squadron. He has incredible credentials, background. And like I said, in terms of the job that he does, he's probably great at being Northcom commander. There's no problem there. Now, O'Shaughnessy is a command pilot with more than 3,000 hours in F-16 Fighting Falcon. including combat hours. This guy's seen combat. In August 2019, O'Shaughnessy stirred up military space community when he said at a defense conference that Elon Musk's SpaceX may have just completely changed our ability to sense threats against America using satellite clusters in space, which really makes you wonder about Musk's moves and those satellites and what they're really for. Is that for great internet or anything else that they talk about, or is it just a military tool? But he let it out. It came out of his mouth and he couldn't take it back, just like Gavin Newsom announcing martial law the other day and saying, we could have martial law, and then everyone in the room just like, what? And then the next thing he said is, we're going to have 25 million cases of corona. No estimate on the planet have anything like that for California. They don't even estimate that many cases for the United States as a whole. So he was pushing to wear the dunce dictator hat. So he said, SpaceX may have just completely changed our ability to sense threats against America using satellite clusters in space by the new technology demonstrated by SpaceX May launch of the initial group of the Starlink mega constellation, which is a mega problem for astronomers who can no longer see stars, and eventually we won't be able to either. We'll be looking up at Starlink constellation. So you lose your rights, you lose the stars. What else do you want to take away? Okay, now he's the commander of Northcom. Before that, he was the commander of Pacific Theater. And what's important about that, and this is just my own insight on this, but I find it strange that during the period that he was the commander in the Pacific, something odd happened over there, which some of you in Hawaii may remember, which was the strange nuclear alert that went out. Let's see if I can find that real quickly here. Miss Olivia, you can.
Yeah, Ed Kaufman wanted to know, does O'Shaughnessy have any known history in fascist tendencies?
Well,
did you find anything?
I found him using kind of blustering language, like we will defeat any enemy and obliterate them at a time of our choosing, that kind of stuff. But a lot of those guys talk that way, so it's hard to tell, frankly. But I feel that it was interesting when I was reading, he briefed Congress on all the activities of Northcom, and at the end of that briefing, he started bragging about how Northcom had been present and securing things during the funeral of former President George H.W. Bush. And I thought that was a weird thing to throw in there because it wasn't requested in the briefing. It was just something he wanted to put across about how great Northcom was. So that was interesting. New York Times, Hawaii panics after alert about incoming missile is sent in error. You may remember that this happened in January of 2018. And that this is particularly interesting because it is in May of 2018 that he assumes his role with Northcom. You might be looking, since he was in charge of the Pacific and was stationed in Hawaii, where Pearl Harbor, at the base at Pearl Harbor, it's just unusual because that's where this kind of alert emergency system test would happen. So a lot of people got to me about that, and it was also strange because the Clintons were in Hawaii at the time. But there were a number of oddnesses about that. It hadn't happened before, and it really could have set off a real nuclear disaster. Were they trying to test him to see how he would respond in a situation like that? Was he involved in running a test? I don't know, but he would have been the commander for those forces in the Pacific located right in Hawaii while this was happening. So I find that interesting, let's say. Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. This is what the emergency alert said. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. Can you imagine waking up to that?
I can't.
People thought it was our friend in North Korea firing off, and his first stop would be Hawaii. If you think about it. So quite fascinating. So I think when we look at him, what's incumbent upon us is not to judge him prematurely or to say there's anything wrong with him. He's just kind of doing his job. However, since he was raised in this Newsweek article as someone who would be the president taking over with COG powers, now we need to take a deeper look at him. And in a journalistic, fair fashion, but nonetheless, to take a really deep look. Because they didn't mention somebody else. They mentioned O'Shaughnessy. Okay, let's read a little bit about Northcom so we understand what we're talking about here. And frequently, one of the things that Professor Scott warned us about was after 9/11, one of the worst things that happened beyond the Patriot Act and, you know, the stripping of rights at airports and things like that was this Northcom development, and how basically we're under Northcom, and that, you know, we're supposed to be under police in the United States, but actually it's Northcom is actually policing the United States. So this is going to get very, very tricky as we go along. U.S. Northern Command was established October 1st, 2002 to provide command and control of the Department of Defense homeland defense efforts. How about defense efforts around for the United States, which is homeland, and to defense support of civil authorities. U.S. Northcom defends America's homeland, the United States of America, right? That's what they should be saying. It's very strange. Protecting our people, national power, and freedom of action. United States Northern Command defends our homeland, deters, detracts, and defeats threats to the United States. They mentioned the United States of America. Can you believe it? I'm impressed. It took a while. Conducts security cooperation activities with allies and supports civil authorities. U.S. Northcom includes air, land, and sea approaches and encompasses the continental United States, Alaska, Canada, Mexico, and the surrounding water. It also includes the Gulf of Mexico, the Straits of Florida, and the hot zone, portions of the Caribbean region to the Bahamas.
Hot zone.
Taking a good look at those Atlantean ruins and locking them down. Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Northcom is responsible for theater security cooperation with Canada, Mexico, and the Bahamas. So, you know, basically, that's where it's at. That's really the United States Command. U.S. Northcom plans, organizes, and executes homeland defense and civil support missions, but has few permanently assigned forces. That's very unusual. This provides unity of command mission accomplishment. Now, I'm going to read something odd that came up about this, which was in an interview that Professor Scott had, and I had a transcript of my interview with him. We've done interviews every year except for last year, since 2014. But this was quite fascinating. Let's see if I can find it here. It's so interesting. All right, I'm going to see if I can jump to the good parts of this. And he did a few interviews when he came out with American Deep State, which is the book I keep recommending. This book really, I think, was his ultimate achievement. Came out in 2015, and I told him that. I thought this was his best. And it's The American Deep State, Wall Street, Big Oil, and the Attack on U.S. Democracy. And that is the doomsday plane there hovering over the White House on the cover of the book, which it did on 9/11. And the doomsday plane holds a nuclear payload. It's never supposed to be over the White House, but it's a big sign that COG was exercised on 9/11. Okay. What he says is, there are really two halves to my book. There is the settled condition of the deep state, and then there is this moving force that has been instituting change, particularly since 9/11, but as far back as Iran-Contra. And that is things which are done under the cover of continuity of government planning, COG planning. This is what Oliver North, if you remember our friend Oliver North from the Iran-Contra crisis, he got asked, and he mentioned COG, and they shut him down fast because they didn't want any of that coming out. Continuity of government, that is the things that were done under COG planning. This is what Oliver North was doing for the mid-1980s when he was asked very astutely if he was planning for suspension of the U.S. Constitution. he was planning for the suspension, and the answer was he didn't get to speak the answer. A gavel came down from the chairman, the Democratic chairman, Daniel Inouye. I may say that we couldn't go into this public session, but yes, he was planning for the suspension of the Constitution, and I can name 3 ways in which I think it has been since suspended. This was 2015. This is the core of the COG part of the book. These 3 things. First of all, warrantless surveillance, because, we're protected from that in the Constitution. That was instituted shortly after 9/11, shortly after COG was implemented for the first time on that day of 9/11. And of course, we all know about how Edward Snowden, and we all know that now, but we should have known it then. It's really not a secret. The second one goes with it, and to me is even more ominous: warrantless detention. This is exactly what our friend was talking about, William Barr. Everyone's subject to warrantless surveillance, but a lot of people feel, well, they're never going to detain me, so there's much less interest in it. So moving down. So anyway, that's the second one, warrantless detention. And it's not a possibility, it's something that has happened. And the third one, when Oliver North was talking about it, was the proclamation of martial law, which we see them now just bandying about Newsweek saying, well, some form of martial law. And Gavin Newsom saying, hey, we're going to have martial law here in California if we want. No, you're not. Okay. And then, and this is the third one. This is interesting. When Oliver North was talking about it, it was the proclamation of martial law. They didn't do it that way. But what they have done publicly is to militarize police work or homeland security so that the U.S. Army is now involved in a permanent way in the business of policing citizens. One of the things I think is important enough to put in my first chapter is there is now a permanent brigade that is permanently stationed in the United States, and its job is to deal with civil disturbance. That is to say, if there's an anti-war rally and the police can't make everyone go home, and they certainly use pretty extreme techniques these days like Humvees and so on, but if the police can't do it, then the military will come in. And it's worse than that because the military is involved in regular surveillance all the time. That brigade that he's talking about is Northcom. They are the ones who have the ability and the authority to do that. So a few more hints from Professor Scott, and we'll move on. We live now under an army command, a permanent army command. Northcom for North America, just like the U.S. Army in South America, has Southcom. Now we have Northcom. Now, when we have forces in different countries, that's a different thing. But suddenly, when you're in charge of policing America with the Army, that's a big problem. They're treating us the way they have learned to treat the rest of the world, and that is not good. That is, they treat us like they treat enemies. So Northcom is looking at us, the citizens of the United States, according to Professor Scott, as the enemy. And he has a lot of facts to back that up. One last thing here. The purpose of the Posse Comitatus Act, which, by the way, came about in 1878, so that's long-standing law, was it ended the Reconstruction in the South because the South were able to successfully say, we'll vote for your presidential candidate if you get the Army off our backs. This is after the Civil War, and then they rolled in the Army to try to control the South. So these acts were passed. I read an article that says, oh no, they're not being violated. But we can see, I think they clearly are, because the point now is, yes, you can bring the Army in an emergency. Well, that's the trick, you see, because officially we're in a state of emergency. We have been ever since September 14th, 2001, and we have a National Emergencies Act. This is what they're using. These states of emergencies are supposed to be reviewed, first of all, by the president, and I'm really shocked that every year they get renewed. First by Bush, that wasn't surprising. He instituted it, but Obama has continued to renew the emergency every September, as has President Trump now. So And then he goes on to say the second part is more scandalous. Congress is required by law, that is not an option, it's a requirement, to review a state of emergency and either to approve it or terminate it. And they're supposed to do that within 6 months. Well, we're well beyond 6 months since September 2001, but Congress has never done this. And he goes along to say, finally, at the end, they ask him, weren't you and Dan Hamburg, who was the congressperson, asked about why Congress did not question this continued state of emergency that makes official the continuity of government activities that are ongoing, and essentially were told to never mind? And Professor Scott answers, as I said, we were told the old law doesn't apply anymore because we're in a new state of affairs with continuity of government. Think about that. This is what they were saying to him after 9/11. So on their side, they're already looking for opportunities to implement this continuity of government rule. So I think when we look at it now, we have to look at COVID-19 as the instrument for them doing this. On one hand, we have a health crisis to be dealt with, but the way that they've rolled in this Northcom aspect and the way that they're calling out the National Guard, and I've gone through the articles for every state that they've done this for and really gotten into it. And for me, this is the prelude to exercising Northcom. And one of the things that they came out with in military.com just recently is bringing back the draft, 5 possibilities for the future of military conscription. So this is easy. You cripple the country and then everyone needs something, and then you institute a draft and you draft these people in. This is very unusual.
Well, and at least you'd get paid.
Yes.
You'd get fed.
True. Right. You wouldn't have to hang out for canned goods from Mayor Walsh here in Boston who wants to pass them out. Okay.
Well, even I had a little fantasy there. I forget what we were listening to. We were listening to somebody saying that the Fed was going to be hiring police, basically, security officers.
Yes.
And I thought, and they get paid very well. And
That's
I had a little
right.
light bulb over my head for a minute. I was like,
Fed security. Tens of thousands of Guard personnel to be called up in coronavirus response. Tens of thousands. That's the way and the thing is, you can use the National Guard in your state. They just called out 2,000 members here in Massachusetts, and they can assist with all these things and all the rest of it. And they would, look into these different things that they could help with, infrastructure projects, setting up these large-scale health bunkers, whatever it happened to be. However, we've gone from this very low numbers of deaths, low numbers of cases, to now the National Guard. Now they're talking about Northcom coming in. Now we're seeing tanks as support. Before we get into this kind of Mad Max dystopian totalitarian takeover, I think we better stop and make them prove their case to a civilian independent panel, and then to push back on the military coming in and controlling everything and get back to constitutional government, which they seem to be trying to remove in the case of just the last few weeks, which is absurd. All using the media driving the hype, if you breathe on somebody and all the rest of it. I know that, you can look at a health crisis and there are ways and means to deal with it. But if you can hype people, just like the terrorist threat, was there a terrorist threat during the 9/11 period? There was. But there's, the idea that they had these varying levels of it, and then they rolled out every time they wanted to do something extra and take more rights away, they would roll out a film of some guy, it didn't even look like bin Laden anymore. He had, this guy was like 20 years younger. And so we have to think about, have we seen this movie before? But now they seem to be playing for all the marbles. Why? Well, one of the reasons that we got into before this really even kicked in my conversation with Catherine Austin Fitz, who will be coming back on the show soon, is, she said, look, these forces want a digital currency, and they need the Internet of Things. They want the digital train tracks. They need to push this through. So we didn't know it at the time, but they were going to be using the coronavirus to do this, because you see all these articles now saying, oh, cash might be a carrier, so no one will want to reach for their wallet anymore. It's like, please give me the vaccination chip that says I can get money out of the bank.
Mm-hmm.
This is really where they're moving the needle towards. And, one of the things I was going to do, they have this doomsday clock that's like, it's getting closer and closer to doomsday, and I was going to have a fascism clock that we could look at what point does it actually tilt over into midnight when it's completely fascist. And it's getting there pretty quick, but it doesn't have to go there. This is a crucial thing, I think, for us to keep in mind. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're going deep now on this corona situation and the state of emergency that they've declared, and all of the continuity of government and Northcom moves that they're hitting up. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly, and it's great to have so many of you here with us. This is a picture from yesterday. It's members of the National Guards have been manning test sites in New York. So New York's got the National Guard invoked and already doing the streets and doing their best. But we're already seeing this presence now. It's not, are they going to call it up? It is, they already have integrated it. And in Russia, we saw something kind of interesting, which I think is going to be coming here shortly. Russia invokes fake news law to order removal of coronavirus reports from the web. This is a very interesting move, very fascist move on the Russians' part. And I think that Putin is looking at us and being like, oh, I'm not repressive enough. And this is interesting, though, because one of the things that Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, who I brought up over and over again on this program and suggested should be fired with good reason, because over and over again, he's led the Trump administration to the brink of World War III, getting them into the hype around assassinating the number 2 man in Iran, Soleimani, and talking about throwing people off of social media for disagreeing with the U.S. government, things of this nature, and now pushing this. He is somebody that in the shakeout, they need to get rid of Pompeo. But you can see that his notification on Twitter about, oh, it might be the Russians, it might be the Chinese who are disagreeing with our stance on Corona. That's what they want to do. They want to take shows like this one and all of these voices that are raising these things, shut them off, have an excuse to shut them off, because otherwise, what are you going to do? Public opinion is turning against you. That is where we're at. So that gives us some hint there. I have more to go on, but we need to jump into questions now, or we won't have any time. So, Miss Olivia? It's
I'm
up to
looking
you.
for it. There's a question about Pompeo saying something this week. Do you know what it is?
It might be that. It might be that.
No.
He said that this is a, when he was talking.
Oh, it's a live exercise?
Yes. He was talking about Corona, and he said it was a live exercise. And he just kind of spilled that there on the stage. And no one knew what to make of it. But it makes the most sense, doesn't it? That you would take this and you would use it as a dry run for what would really happen in the case. And you collect all the data about how people reacted, et cetera. And it seemed like in the first few weeks, that's how they were checking it out. But this other thing seemed to come in and piggyback on it. And now we're looking at totalitarian overdrive. It's quite interesting. This chart was interesting to me because, let's see if this comes up. They were saying, the U.S. has all these cases, right around 300 deaths in a nation of 330 million people. Like I said, 72,000 deaths last year from drug overdoses. This is 300, and so the level of emergency there is certainly quite fascinating. Those white areas are where it's not. And this is fascinating to me because we have large swaths of South America, almost complete Africa, Greenland, and all these other places, including Mexico, with no cases. What's going on there? Tell me how that adds up. the Mexican part is very, very interesting to me because the Mexican president went out and sort of partied in public, and he was doing all these things, and it was like a real defiant tone. And it just makes you wonder when you look at Mexico, why aren't they having these cases? So that's something, mystery there. I'm not going to try to answer that one. Okay, I'm going to read the definition of martial law so that we know that when we're in it. And also, I mean, there's so many interesting things. I guess I mentioned the malaria drug treatment aspect and how the media was trying to shoot that down, and Trump likes to bring it up. And that showed me there's some difference, or there's some assumed difference between Trump and the media on this, that was a very interesting move, I think, by every stretch of the imagination, because what was happening was Trump was registering disapproval. And that caught me by surprise when Trump was on board with them for so much of this. Friday, he got a little testy, and he started to call them disinformation artists, and he mentioned the deep state and things like that again. That type of activity, I think, shows a fracture in this. And if he's excited and says, well, maybe we can get this drug to work, then all these other globalist deep state people are looking at this and saying, we won't be able to run the op if there's even some sense of a cure. We won't be able to do this. So they were really trying to turn it down. And you saw like real, piranhas like Rachel Maddow coming onto the screen and being like, Trump shouldn't be allowed to even have press conferences anymore. I mean, thank you, Eva Braun. I appreciate that. I really do. But we have to get a handle on the history of how they use these emergency powers to understand the current emergency. Not to say that, Corona is a hoax or anything like that. They have a real medical crisis, health crisis to deal with, but that does not rise to the level of a nuclear emergency of taking away everyone's rights. It's absurd. So that's what we have to put across. This is the definition of martial law, and then we'll get to your questions. Fair enough?
Fair enough.
All right. Martial law is the imposition of direct military control of normal civilian functions by a government, especially in response to a temporary emergency such as invasion or major disaster. Martial law can be used by governments to enforce their rule over the public, as seen in multiple countries listed below. I mean, really like Thailand and things like that. Nothing to do with America. Such incidents may occur after a coup d'etat, such as in Thailand, when threatened by popular protests, such as in China, Iranian Green Movement that led to the takeover by the Revolutionary Guards to suppress political opposition. That's Poland in 1981, or to stabilize insurrections, Canada, the October Crisis of 1970. Martial law may be declared in cases of major natural disasters. However, most countries use a different legal construct, such as state of emergency. Martial law has also been imposed during conflicts and in cases of occupations where the absence of any other civil government provides for an unstable situation. World War II reconstruction, and so on. Let's see. Now, typically the imposition of martial law accompanies curfews. You've been hearing a lot about curfews everywhere. The suspension of civil law, civil rights, and habeas corpus. We just saw the DOJ bar trying to sneak this through. And the application of extension of military law to civilians. Civilians defying martial law may be subjected to military court-martial. So not even a regular trial. That's why they want to hold them all. In the scenario, Barr says, hey, I'm going to hold everyone indefinitely detained. I'll put all the people who don't like what I'm doing in a stadium, and then I'll do a military court-martial on all of them. You don't even have to face a justice system. This is the kind of bizarre conversation that they've led us into. They've led us down this rabbit hole, and the only way to get out of it is to bring attention to the fact that they've created this dystopian reality based on what is a containable health crisis, and they are doing it under the guise of trying to solve that health crisis. And so if their goal was to solve the health crisis, then we're all for it. There's no problem. The problem is they want indefinite detention. They want people imprisoned in their homes. They want to crash the economy. And they're using measures and throwing around continuity of government figures, and they're throwing around generals who they're going to replace the presidents. This is where they're going with it. That's not even something that we're projecting on them. They're saying it in the open. So it is a crisis of communication, and the things that we need to communicate is our intense disapproval of their slicing and dicing of the Constitution. There's no question about it in my mind. Yes, Miss Olivia. With that,
well,
we'll go to your
we've
questions.
taken our citizenship for granted. We've been lucky enough to do that, and
That's
I think
true.
it's time. I'm feeling extremely patriotic, and I think it's kind of awakening,
Yes.
kind of latent patriotism in all of us. So a couple things I
great
wanted
point.
to throw in there. Rat Boy Genius says, it looks like the way the test is designed, it is for antibodies. So once you get it, you will test positive for the rest of your life in some cases. I think I have heard that before, and I think that's important to note.
We had an important piece of information from a nurse who said that they had stopped testing for coronavirus with flu patients because the flu gave a false positive for corona, and they were adding those numbers in. And then at a certain point, the hospital said, "Oh, those numbers are wrong. We weren't supposed to be adding them." But in the meantime, the newspapers are running all over the all over the place, saying, "Hey, this has just gone up X amount."
Right, and you're sick. You're on a ventilator immediately.
Yes,
you die. Right, it's just factored into the coronavirus deaths regardless, right?
Well, one of the things that has really inflated those numbers is the amount of people. They've tried to do this with the story of the Disney person, but and these are sad stories, don't get me wrong, but many of the cases, they will be terminal cases who they will then test positive for corona, or maybe they'll just be tested and they'll assume that it is. And they already had these pre-existing conditions. And now even the medical professionals are starting to state that. But the headlines are still running everyone into the Black Plague. And this is part of the thing. We need to get a seriously strong handle on the media at this point. No question about it. Go for it.
Okay. I thought this was really fascinating. Shashakila says, armored equipment rolled into downtown Houston last night. There was an ad in Craigslist for, quote, role actors in Houston this week and next week.
Role
so
actors.
Anybody want to do any research about Craigslist ads for actors
That
in your
is,
states? We would be interested in tracking
I think it's
that.
important to keep an eye on that. I know that, we've seen this debate about crisis actors before. It's a fact that they're used. So the question is, does that come into any of this? We'll have to see.
Kate is asking about Dr. Wolfgang Vodarg.
Yes.
Do you want to bring him up at all?
Well, it's so interesting. This is someone who's a doctor in Germany who studies these types of things. And he came forward. He gave us a lot of info through a video, which is out there and people are really picking up on. And there's a few points that he made in a recent video. Let's see. But he was trying to tell us that so many of the political processes have taken this thing and run over the cliff with it when the medical professionals haven't been so careful, and the ones that have caught it and said, oh, they are blowing this out of proportion, those people just aren't listened to. So I'll just read a little bit of this. He says, in Wuhan, there's the biggest safety lab for viruses in all of China. So there are a lot of experts on the topic dealing with it all day long. They did tests with a few patients, less than 50, and Wuhan has 11 million people. They looked for viruses they had and examined their RNA in the lab and found a new type that attracted their attention. When a virologist finds something like this, he puts it in a global database that's accessible for scientists all over the world. In Berlin, for example, they checked and compared this new entry and tried to create a test to measure this new variant of coronavirus, because that's the thing. The coronavirus is always in the mix. And this is something else that he pointed out, that those viruses aren't new. It is just supposedly the strain that came out of it. So he goes further along on how they did the tests, and then how it wasn't thorough type of testing you would expect for this type of reaction. And then I'm going to move down here and see if I can grab another quote. So while looking for a specific virus, for example, coronavirus, you can examine the total population, that you will find is that presumably around 8% to 10% of the population will have some kind of virus that makes them sick. But if you examine medical practices, do your tests there to determine who is sick, and then, of course, you find a lot of more positive cases. If you examine hospitals and take samples from them, you will find even more corona-infected people. That is to say, depending on the proportions of the population you examine, whether it is the whole population or patients in the waiting room, or if you examine very ill patients in intensive care units that are about to die, you will expectantly find 7 to 10% to 15% coronavirus every time you do a test. However, if they die from the coronavirus or of another virus while just having the coronavirus, that can't be determined for sure. When you look at the death rates in Italy, you want to know where the tests have been taken. This is the thing. They haven't given that kind of information. Where and how have these few available tests been used? If they were used in a hospital or in serious terminally ill cases, then obviously the coronavirus death rate rises. So it gives the appearance of being high because of the specific group of people examined. So he's making the real point here about how you have to very carefully examine the numbers around these things. Cheryl Atkinson made the same point, and when she went back to the CDC with it, they took their number of 4% death rate down to 1.4% just in her conversation. How much further down is that going to go? So this is the nature of the problem with the sensationalism driven by the media. The media is a real problem on this one.
Yes. Right, and you would have to investigate each one of those deaths. Did they die with COVID-19 or of COVID-19?
Yes.
This is what happens.
Yes.
You can have a certain type of cancer, but you are taken out by some other illness, right?
Exactly.
But so it wasn't the cancer that took you out, or vice versa. So it's interesting.
Well, the last piece of that is that the virologists created something very sensational here. With their creation, they really impressed the Chinese government as well. The Chinese government made something really big out of it. Suddenly, there was a vitally important, politically, completely exceeding the virological frame. So, in other words, they had taken the political situation of the virus and extrapolated it out and assumed all these medical emergency powers, when a careful examination of the cases wouldn't have caused all that alarm. They might have had a problem with it anyway, but it wouldn't have been like this. The doctor's name is Wolfgang Wodarg, and Catherine Austin Fitz has really been circulating that. So if you check her Twitter feed, you're going to find it there. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's great to have everyone here with us. And we are going deep now on this COVID virus sensationalism, I should say, and all the kind of Northcom aspects and the continuity of government aspects that they've been used to ride on the back of this to try to close down the country and all of our rights associated with it, and how it's very important for us to have the dialogue directly with the government on this and push back on that media frenzy and get things back into a normal situation before they shred the Constitution overnight. And what else is up, Ms. Olivia? Nicholas
Karupis wants to know, big question, what are, if any, comorbidity factors in mortality reporting?
No, I mean, you know, there's so many. I would actually recommend the work of Cheryl Atkinson on some of that. And like I said, when I get deep into the numbers on it, I'm just working from articles. And I think if you want to go deep on that you want to go with someone who's dedicating report to the medical aspect. What I'm working on is, it's clear that the voices around the medical side have been stifled. And they only want in the media this one-note thing. I'm very familiar with how that disinformation works. So when I see that happening, I realize that they are constructing a narrative for a purpose. And then I'm integrating the work that they're doing, trying to get COG in place with that emergency. That's more where we're coming from. But on the deeper numbers, you know, that's something I think I would study independently. Yes.
GDNPB says, would be interesting to know the percentage of people testing positive got this year's flu shot. I know they are linking them.
There's no question. There's more and more reports that a lot of the elderly who passed away as a result of the corona had taken the flu shot.
Mhm.
And we know that many of these excessive vaccines weaken the immune system. So these things are very related. It's an uncomfortable topic, but it has to be looked at if you're going to get real numbers.
Right. Seniors get a much stronger, I think it's 4 times stronger flu shot.
Yes.
So,
Let's
and
keep rolling.
which already is suspicious in and of itself. Okay. I actually love Kate Schneider's question right here. Is there a middle ground here? Pendulum swinging from Q fantasy of cabal arrests and true justice, and other end is doom and gloom. FEMA camps, population control. Is there a middle ground?
No, there's no question. Absolutely. And that is a great question, Kate. One of the things I would say that's crucial to remember is that the thing that's going on the independent media side, which is the fantasy that there's some secret white hat group that's taking care of all this, that's a very dangerous fantasy because it lulls you into a sense of not doing anything. It's also, there's no evidence for it anywhere. And so we know that side has serious issues, and we brought them up on this program. And then it is interesting because you would almost assume that the Q types of people would go into the kind of Alex Jonesy FEMA camp, presentation of this. But what's interesting is the really over the top, we're in lockdown and this is it. It's fascinating to me because there's so much handwriting on the wall for the overreach. The question is, that overreach has a snapback point, and it's either the public catches it or the forces inside disagree with the level of overreach. And so I think we're in that weird period now where we're seeing them gear up to do all these things. And I think that there are forces in that whole kind of Bill Gates, say, vaccine Davos crowd world where they're looking at this and trying to just ride their new system in. So I think that there is the opportunity to say it's certainly not the Q fantasy white hats coming to save the day. You wouldn't have to lock down countries to arrest, some bad actors. That doesn't make any sense. So that's absurd. We can completely dismiss that as a joke. And then you look at the kind of darker slant of things where this is just a complete takeover. And I think what you realize is you're always balanced in a democracy against forces who will take away your rights, who will supplant the Constitution with their own version of reality. And we've seen that in little ways with the thought police. They don't like you to say a certain word. They were getting to a point before all this happened where you couldn't say he, she anymore. And this is how bad this is getting. And
we don't care at all about that anymore.
Right, yeah. Like I said, the progressive position was basically, how can I have my transgender baby in prison, right? This is where they were going. So this kind of thing, these forces will use any kind of divisions in society to get this conversation off balance. And I think it's important on our end to realize that whether it's 9/11, the Kennedy assassination, Watergate, Iran-Contra, all these deep events that we've been through, BCCI, anywhere where they've supplanted, or the great financial coup d'etat of 2008, where they just took all this money out of the treasury. And now let's not forget we have this 21 trillion, the missing trillions problem that Catherine Austin Fitts has brought forward so articulately. Her actual number is $60 trillion. Would you create an emergency and wipe out everything and try to install a new system of totalitarian government to hide the fact that you looted $60 trillion from the treasury? Yes, you would. So I think it's important for us to say this situation can be turned around, and it gets turned around. The media is important. Our voices are important. And that's how you push it back. And we saw that Rand Paul, just before he was diagnosed with having the coronavirus, had come out majorly against this action of William Barr seeking detention. So we're always poised between totalitarianism and a democratic republic. Kennedy said it himself when he said that we must guard liberty against those who would use security as an answer to take away your rights. There's no point in a nation surviving if its traditions and laws do not survive with it. That's a paraphrase, but this is basically what he put across. He knew, and like I said, I want everybody to watch 7 Days in May, which is a movie from 1964, because Kennedy helped get that movie off the ground because he felt it was important for people to realize that these elements could usurp a presidency. And very shortly, they had him assassinated. So we have to, just like Eisenhower, what did Eisenhower tell us? He said we have to guard against the military-industrial complex. They've been warning us about this. That was 1961. Okay, so you're looking at almost 60 years of us in this fight. When it comes up, the only way to maintain our liberty is to make them accountable. And in this case, you can make them accountable and still sort of satisfy the middle managers by going along with, the edicts and the medical advice and all the rest of it. But that doesn't supplant the Constitution. You still need, to stand up and get respected for your point of view on the Constitution. You're a United States citizen. That's what you're born into. That's your legacy. It's your heritage. And around the world, I would say the same thing, but in America, that Constitution is very crystal clear. And the forces of continuity of government it's the exact opposite. It literally is, it was intended as, if we get nuked, we need some kind of a plan if the president and the Speaker of the House and the Vice President are gone. That's where it came from. And they've used that and they've sort of tricked it out into this weird, let's install Northcom as the commander. Yes.
Okay, Silver Fox.
Great question.
Is this a medical industrial complex taking over the military industrial complex? Is this the New World Order? How do Soros, Rothschilds, and Rockefellers fit into all of this?
Well, it's interesting. Catherine Austin Fitts, the former HUD secretary, who is on this program very often, and I've known for years, she said something very interesting, which was, we've let psychopaths rule too long.
Mm-hmm.
So the very nature of your question, you think about Soros, and we think about some of these really bad actors that have been in there. We think the abuses of the Fed. The situation has just gone on too long. And I think that people have been happy to get by, raise their kids, and keep things moving and hoping for a better world. But we've lost the quality of political leaders that have been so crucial in the past. And we know a lot of them in the 60s and 70s were completely either killed or they were discredited. And so we got into leadership, which was really flimsy and getting by to get by. And so many of these people were middle managers. They don't know necessarily where the tyranny is coming from. They just know that they need to play into it. And that's why you saw so many bizarre things. From the Bushes with 9/11 and the Iraq War, which was the biggest foreign policy blunder the United States ever got into, to the coup d'etat in 2008 with Goldman Sachs taking over. And then, a lot of people have put a lot into Trump, hoping that he would do better. But I do have to point this out, which is there's twice as many people from Goldman Sachs in his administration than were in Bush and Obama's administrations combined. So that equation just doesn't add up, and I wish the president the best. I wish he would pull us through this. And if he is being pulled along with this, or if he is part of it, to get out of it. But if there is that support on the ground, if there is that pushback on the ground, then there's a chance. Yes. Okay.
Now you addressed this, you've addressed this in other shows, but you haven't addressed it tonight.
Yes.
Richard Warner wants to know your take on Event 201.
Whenever you see operations like that, actually, I caught something. I'm glad you mentioned that, because RFK Jr., who, does a fantastic job on bringing us vaccine awareness. And just before all this stuff came up, there were all these mandatory vaccine things that were happening. They were trying to get rid of the religious exemption. I thought that was weird, because they wanted everybody in this thing. They needed everyone in this, which was telling me that they needed every physical person to be resonating to this particular thing, because there's no reason for instance, to go after Hasidic Jews,
Mm-hmm.
in these small communities and try to force them against their religion to take these vaccines. There was something fundamentally transhumanist about that. So Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was out there on the front lines of this, and he was talking a lot about where they were going with this. And he said, look, they've got you taking 78 vaccines. There's no law that makes the vaccine companies accountable because in 1986, they put it on the books that they can't be sued. So they don't even go through the normal kind of gymnastics that a pharmaceutical company goes through to put out a pharmaceutical when they make vaccines. That's really problematic. But one of the things that came up was Bill Gates, when he was in a Reddit AMA the other day, gave us some hint maybe of where their thinking is going. And he said the question of which businesses should keep going is tricky. Certainly food supply and the health system. We still need water, electricity, and the internet. Thank you. Thank you for water, Bill. I appreciate that. Supply chains for critical things need to be maintained. Countries are still figuring out what to keep running. Eventually, we will have some digital certificates to show who has recovered or been tested recently, or when we have a vaccine, who has received it. This is what they're trying to do and what he funded, which is to create this tattoo that gives you all your medical information out and make sure that you got your mandated vaccine, because then you can get access to, say, a driver's license or a passport. So that's the kind of totalitarian system they are rolling in. And I think that really kind of answers to where they're going with this. The only other thing I can say about it is when they did that exercise 201, it was some of the things that they came to the conclusion of was about stopping this measles outbreak, right? You remember them freaking out about measles? Measles was kind of like an early coronavirus thing. They were looking for a scare. And the measles thing was fascinating. So they got together and they said, whatever it is that goes down, we have to, using any means possible, get people to accept this measles vaccine. That's the type of stuff that they were working on. So either they got incredibly lucky or the operation went live the way Monk Pompeo said it did. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We've really done a deep dive here on this continuity of government Northcom plan. And I think we've introduced Terry O'Shaughnessy. I always feel like there's more we can do with that. There's a couple of quick things I want to show, and then we're going to take your last couple of questions. Here is something. Now, what is that designer, Miss Olivia?
Louis Vuitton. How do you know that? Everybody knows that.
I just want to use your fashion expertise. Get your Louis Vuitton chemical mask now. Roll that out.
I thought this was a joke when I first saw it. This is real.
It is real. That is so hip. Getting
it's insane.
COVID's hip.
How much are they charging for that? Do you know?
I don't know. I'm scared to ask. Maybe we can get some kind of stimulus just for those masks. God. Just before this all happened, by the way, in November, the Federal Reserve announced they were looking into developing a digital currency in the U.S. They confirmed it. So we know that that's where they were headed. Well, with all the things that happened, they kind of got their wish, right? Because they're moving this out at lightning speed. Yes, Miss Olivia, go for it.
Oh, Carla Waldecki wanted to know, and I've only heard about this peripherally. What do you think of the 10 days of darkness thing? Shut off the internet. What's up with that? Have you researched that?
Yeah, I have problems with these things that come up. And this is kind of problematic, where they just come out of nowhere and they say they're going to shut everything off for 10 days. And then when the lights go back on, everything's going to be hunky-dory.
Is that what it is?
Yeah.
That's hope porn?
That's the one that I've heard about. Okay. So maybe there's another one. But it's very important to stay grounded during this period, because there are a lot of stories running around like that. And the worst ones, in my opinion, are not the fear porn, oddly enough, but the hope porn are the most, because they just have no foundation. And people saying, well, this person got in touch with me and told me everything's going to be fine. And when it's all done, we're all going to have our own alternative energy machines, and they're going to show us what's in the UFO file. And all the criminals will be in jail. We'll round up Gotham City's worst. They're all away, and they'll punish all of the, Pedo Island and all that stuff. And everyone will live happily ever after. Yeah, with you sitting on your couch and doing nothing about it? No, it doesn't work that way. Has anything in your life ever worked that way? Unless you grew up a Rothschild or Rockefeller. I mean, it doesn't work in life. You have to work. There's a principle of labor in our system, and there's kind of a spiritual aspect to that also. I've done a lot on the Gurdjieff work on this program. And one of the things that Gurdjieff had always said to his students, this great Russian-Armenian teacher, he said, the biggest problem I have with my students is they all expect roast pheasant to fly into their mouths. Now, roast pheasant is kind of like a really fancy dish back then. But this is the thing. You just expect it all to show up and be there. And that's the problem with the kind of hopium stuff around groups like Q and things like that. I have no problem with the people who believe in Q. I think that it is dangerous, though, the people who are promoting it now, because it's giving them a false sense of security. And these stories are this is some good fantasy action, right? Yeah.
There's always great fantasies going around.
I'm reminded of this, guy who's sitting there. It's, getting robbed and on the subway, and they're taking his watch off, and he's thinking to himself, I'm going to win the lottery, instead of dealing with the criminals that are attacking him. It's a dangerous thing to go into this fantasy mindset, especially when there's no foundation for it. At least, I understand wanting to think positive. I approve of that. And I'm big into thinking positive, but you need to have some foundation, and you need to work to get there. And the idea that's just going to be handed to you, and here's your popcorn, we're going to watch it. That's what the, Wilcock good pollution in alternative media has been about. They're the ones, along with Ben Fulford, who pushed this mass arrest thing. It never happened. It's not going to happen. It's a fantasy. It's a joke. And I'm actually tired of hearing about it, because it was 10 years ago it was brought up. And it's like, that's pretty passé. It didn't work. Shut up about it. Get on with your life. Go through normal channels to get people arrested. And don't appeal
but
don't
that
appeal.
means I'm going to have to do something.
Don't appeal to vigilante fantasies. That's a cheap shot in any media, alternative or mainstream. And, we have a constitution. It applies to criminals too. You take them before criminal justice trials and you put them in jail. You do not let people out of jail who deserve to be in there, because, you have this coronavirus thing going on. And, oddly enough, they just tested Harvey Weinstein, right?
Yes.
He goes down for this thing.
Mm-hmm.
Harvey's got corona, huh? Boy, I guess that means
that was predicted. Everybody saw that coming.
Yeah. Well, it's very strange, isn't it? Because maybe they're thinking they can't afford to have him out there. If he doesn't tell all, who else is he going to take down with him? So it's a very dirty scene on that side of things. But it's a lot of this is very distracting. I guess fundamentally, when I look at it, it's that even with all these things going on, we've always had levels of corruption in the country, and other countries have it even worse. Let's face it. I wouldn't want to be hanging out in Russia now either. But the truth is that when you are dealing with your rights being stripped away through the Constitution, everything else goes to the back. And anyone who's not agreeing because they're in the right-wing camp or the left-wing camp, or they believe in green justice or whatever it is, it doesn't matter. They all get together and they get the Constitution back in place. So people who think that I'm soft on Trump or too hard on Trump, none of that stuff matters. Just get to the point, which is the Constitution's what matters. It gives you the ability to speak out. And that's where we're going with this. That's what the conversation is about. Get up, stand up for your rights. It's Bob Marley.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we need. You got to do it, though, because if you take it lying down, you're going to wake up and Mr. O'Shaughnessy, General O'Shaughnessy, I'm sure he's a nice guy and all the rest, but but he's going to wake up and be your new commander, and you're going to have regional governors that you're going to have to checkpoints and all the rest of it. Is that really what you want? I think any reality would be better than that. So let's work for that. And, let's get a civilian council of medical experts who aren't beholden to the pharmaceutical companies and aren't beholden to the government to look at some of these stats, because we're seeing wild exaggerations all over the place before we launch into, please give me a tanks rolling down my street to patrol the criminal.
They're light armored vehicles.
Yes, after
not
all.
Tanks. Let's be clear.
All right, so we're deep. We've been deep in this episode, and I hope we have represented Peter Dale Scott's information. We're going to come back.
Hold on. I got tons of questions. We're not done.
I know. Well, we're going to take a couple more, but we're going to come back this week. We're going to have a special guest on this and get you more information about what's happening. So there's more info on the way. And one of the things I want to put across is, when I was trying to quote that Children's Defense Fund thing earlier from RFK Jr., one of the things that they were doing around that 201 exercise is the presidential election campaign in the U.S. and the controversial mandatory measles vaccination law in Germany provided perfect timing. I'm quoting from this article in the Children's Defense Fund that RFK Jr. runs. What better than vital terror to influence public opinion and health policies on vaccine battles raging on both sides of the Atlantic? Again, this is October 2019. Quote, they agreed on the priority to achieve 90% measles vaccination coverage around the globe and to use arguments of, quote, health emergencies and, quote, security threats. Health emergency, security threat, that's how they're going to get that 90% vaccination rate, to bypass informed consent laws and constitutional rights. They were scheming with 201 and with this measles group. These groups were scheming to illegally influence people and go around constitutional rights to get these mandates happening. That needs to be explained. Why were they doing that? And is that what they're up to now on a grand scale? It has to be asked and it has to be answered. There's no getting around it. So, they're going to get us into like, hey, Jimmy Fallon's at home. Let's watch him hang out with his family. And people are fighting over paper towels. None of that matters. What matters is who's putting energy and effort behind trying to create health emergency and the impression of security threats to bypass informed consent and laws and constitutional rights. Where is that coming from and why? This is what matters. That's what we're going to get at. And certainly addressing the Northcom issue and returning things back to the strategic situation of constitutional government has to be the first thing on our minds. Really, it's almost like none of the other stuff matters. Okay, now we'll take the rest of your questions.
Okay. Carla Waldecki again. Is it true that when Trump activated the Stratford Act, he opened himself up for assassination or removal?
Well, they've been trying to remove him kind of since he got in, or even before, actually. And I've covered that extensively on this program because the intelligence side that's connected to the deep state, which is most of it, so the Central Intelligence Agency and its associated contractors, didn't want to work with Trump originally. They may have changed that tune. I noticed that Gina Haspel at the last State of the Union stood up and applauded, which you're not supposed to do as a CIA director during Trump's speech. You're supposed to be like a Supreme Court justice. You sit there and no matter what they say, you don't move a muscle. So for her to get up and give him a standing O was strange. And that's just before all this started. And she gave him a standing O on the idea that he wouldn't be giving information to sanctuary cities. He wouldn't be sharing information with them. And then he had some idea about moving military equipment into sanctuary cities. It's very unusual stuff. This is all before. But what I feel like this is something I think to take a look at, because the CIA and Trump have had a very uneasy relationship, and now for them to, the leader to be lauding him is interesting. However, just recently, now they're trying to do the CIA tried to brief Trump on this, but he didn't listen. And so he was the guy in charge and he failed us and all the rest of it. And oh boy, so there is still that anti-Trump thing there. It's very hard to figure out exactly what the parameters of that relationship are. I think sometimes he's in their pocket and sometimes he's not. It's very interesting. Yes.
A lot of different people have noticed that the presidential seal and flag are missing during the COVID-19 conferences.
Well, see, I don't take that too seriously because he has so many people on that stage that, it's to look like a group effort. So if you have the presidential seal, which is for a presidential press conference, you wouldn't have it there. So I thought that was kind of a paper tiger when they were going after that. It didn't mean much to me. Yes.
Okay, I do want to get to this. So JEJ Shirt says, will the lockdown be a global power feed for Arman? And Tricky Vicky said, did you guys hear the president say today that they've opened up our supercomputer capability on finding solutions to this problem? That was kind of scary.
That is fascinating. I think
so. That's AI. Yeah. Hello.
Well, they've got the quantum computing power to do it. This is the interesting thing. It seems like Trump wants to get out of the box.
Well, are they going to make AI seem like the savior, of all of us? Because it came up with the solution for this. It just suddenly occurred to me.
True. Yes. They very well could.
The Messiah.
Hey, listen. Considering the alternative they're offering, if they want to make AI come up with it, it's okay with me. I do think it's interesting, though, because when you look at Trump, when he has mentioned things like maybe this malaria drug will work, and I've pointed this out, the media seems to go bonkers not to have that be true, because then it ruins the whole thing. It's almost like it's an interesting thing with Trump. Because does he even understand the level to which they're trying to do this or that he's participating in it? It raises the question. And then at other times you think, oh, he's very well along with it, So I think that one's still an open question. Yes.
Humble House, what about the potential for mass gun sweeps if the Constitution is suspended? That is a concern. Everybody's going out. Gun sales are through the roof.
Yes, it's true. Well, the mayor of Los Angeles made a very unusual set of comments about this, and he said, if people don't obey the curfew, then we're going to pick them up, which is funny because they're letting criminals out of jail, but you're going to arrest these people. What are you going to do with them? Indefinitely detain them? It's very unusual the way these guys are acting. But one of the things he said was, people are acting crazy. They're buying guns. We're going to pay them a visit. What does that mean? And they also have suspended gun sales in certain small counties. They haven't done that in any broad way. People have bought plenty of ammo and guns. Like I said, that's not how I believe things are going to be settled by any stretch of the imagination. And I don't, recommend that big kind of bunker mentality. I think, a lot of this is going to be solved in the courtroom because the Constitution is the greatest legal document that we have on our side. It is a binding document. And if you remove it, it's going to be hell to pay. There's no getting around it. It's like saying there are no laws in the country. So suspending the Constitution because of a nuclear attack or something is one thing. If you're trying to use a health crisis to whip up a martial law situation, which is what it appears like they're doing, very logically, then I think that you're going into a territory that is extremely unwise, because fundamentally Americans are beholden to that Constitution. If you shred it, you can keep up this media hype, but you can already see people are starting to question it. The DOJ looking for secret powers to prosecute and hold people indefinitely may have been the deal breaker. Maybe if that hadn't leaked, they'd have that lead time. But now I feel like their time's running out to accomplish their op. So it's an interesting situation that we're all in. And I do think it's important to remember that, we're all going to get through it. That's important too. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's great to have everyone here. We went deep tonight on O'Shaughnessy, the leader of Northcom, which Newsweek suggested was going to be our next president under COG. geez, that's interesting. I guess they should have checked with us first. We try to give that foundation that Professor Scott laid on continuity of government, and we've been getting great questions from the ideas room. We'll take just 2 more questions, and then we'll close it down until next time. Yes.
Jonathan Fries, is there a connection to the asteroid and the group saying they have photographic proof of Planet X?
That is really interesting. I'd like to save that for a show that I'm doing around those 2020 asteroids and how they were saying, hey, it's going to explode in the atmosphere. Look, there's been so many unusual fireballs, most of them over the hot zone, which is particularly interesting. And so I think that we're looking at something unusual going on in relation to space. And that's why it's interesting. Whoever shows up around this seems to have, even our friend O'Shaughnessy, he's the head of North American Spacecom, these in the aerospace wing, this is, to me, indicative that Trump's creating the Space Force at the end of December, and Democrats and Republicans just going like, hey, sure, yeah, go for it. There's something weird about these aspects, and that's why we track the fireballs when they come up. But certainly there could be something in relation to that. And Miss Olivia.
A cult fan says the Constitution, its only keepers the people. George Washington.
There it is.
So what do we do?
Well, no, we're doing it. We're doing it. And people around the country are doing it. It is, but I think what's important is to remember that we're under the Constitution and that they're trying to impose something else. So if they're going to do that, even temporarily, we're going to need a buffer between the forces that are trying to do that and the public. For example, like I suggested, a civilian commission to look at the medical results, to judge the nature of what actually is happening. And also political experts should be involved with that. You can't go down the way that they're trying to make it go down. America was never built for that kind of a takeover. Whoever thought that they could pull this off was in error. And I would implore them to back off from a reckless course of action. But I think on our side, it's very dangerous to protect those rights. And, if you are home and, you're not able to get in a group and protest, of course, then good. Spend your day emailing them, letting them know that you want the Constitution to be enforced. And tell your friends that the Constitution is at risk, and cite the information from this program, which is all documented, by the way. I didn't even engage in any speculation for this one. This one's all on the books. So there's a lot for us to do, and we can do it. This is the thing. They're saying, hey, everyone get together. We can beat the COVID thing. And I'm sitting here saying, let's get together and beat the anti-constitutional use of the COVID. So that's where I guess the rub is. But certainly, hopefully we get through the health crisis aspect of it, and the constitutional crisis part we're going to have to deal with sooner than later. So that's the way we're going.
Well, I think individually, can you speak to how we can best use this time in quarantine?
Well, you can.
I think certainly studying up on natural health, being more self-sufficient, getting in better shape, dieting, dropping a few pounds, feeling, getting healthier, because,
yes.
Whether it's a virus or a bacteria or anything, your immunity, it starts with your immunity, and we can all increase our immunity with our general health. And also, I just have to say, I think that we need to be badasses, and study martial arts.
Yeah.
If you don't have a gun, or if you do have a gun, and do that. We need to
use it. Yeah, use it as an
wisely.
excuse. Absolutely, to better yourself. And of course, and a lot of people have come to me and said, hey, there's a good aspect to this. Like certain things are happening. Absolutely, but that's the way that we are. Which is we have that ability to take a situation and turn it around. We should not look for a gloomy outcome. It's just the thing is, when you're faced with a real situation of danger, you must address it on some level. The pushback is the first level of addressing it, and I think that we can see people starting to take their power back on that part. You're starting to see people not going so along with this. And that's important, I think. And, they had this thing where they said COVID rebels revel on a beach, right? And I thought, oh, that's what they're going to do. COVID rebels. It's a sick.
It actually is a great name.
It is, but it's a sick thing, right? Because that's what they'll do if people go to protest when it comes down to it. And they'll be like, you'll hear reports, because they'll shut me off on the internet and anyone else is useful. And they'll say, they'll get rid of Gigi Young's channel who's out there. And they'll take us off the air and they'll have these other things up and it'll be like, National Guard rounded up 170 COVID rebels today. And, they were taught lessons by hanging out in a stadium while they were given re-education. This is where they want to go. That's the problem with the sick class that took over the Zuckerberg and the Gates, the Davos crowd, who were Bezos and all that. They were not suited. Elon Musk, at least he said a few things like the panic around the COVID is over the top, but he's another one. They're not good enough people. They literally aren't. They don't have the ethical strength. They don't have the moral fiber, and they don't have the sensibility. They're out of touch. Remember Mike Bloomberg? He spent $800 million because he thought he could win his election on Skype, and then he comes out on stage and he says, I bought every one of those congressmen. And then he's surprised that he loses. These people are out of touch. They've been living in a system. It's interesting. Fitz has a good name for this. She says, people who win in a rigged game get sloppy. And that's what's going on here. These are some sloppy people. And if they want to use the iron fist of the military to correct the clumsiness of how they've rolled this out, then we need to push back on that as American citizens, because we control the government, we control the military. So it's ours. It's ours to take. And, take a deep breath and in little ways, day by day, in big ways, day by day, push back on it. You're under the Constitution in America. And in other countries, those countries too, they have that ability. In the UK, in France, in Spain, in Mexico, push back against those things. Well, I guess Mexico, they don't have the cases, so push back against the drug cartels if you're in Mexico.
Oh, did you actually get into the Rockefeller document?
No, I think we'll save that for the next show.
Okay.
And thank you for reminding me. That is interesting, though, because they did a simulation of this back in 2010, and it looks damn similar. But I will produce the document. I'll have that for everyone. What great questions tonight in the Ideas Room. It's fantastic to have everyone here. We will be back with you next Friday. If anything goes on of an alarming nature, which is bound to happen, we may be back with you a lot sooner. We're keeping very close on the reports on this. And that's all I can say for now. Nicely done, Miss Olivia.
I have some super chatters to
Yes,
thank.
please.
Okay, Anthony Liberté, Vendover, a cult fan, Michael Collier, PJD, 23 Skidoo, Carol Crumlish, Matute 11, Eurythmy is Fun, Charles Marlowe, Flood, Sidvich, and Russell Boyles. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for supporting the show and the work that we do here. We want to kind of do the best kind of reporting for you, and it makes things a lot easier to make it happen. And we will, and thank you also to our supporters and subscribers, and for everyone showing up tonight.
And I just wanted to say, everybody, I have so many questions left over, and I'll make sure that DJ sees them all.
I think, yeah. Well, we'll do another show coming up this week, so we'll definitely get them in. Thank you so much. And I'll do a couple of shout outs here at the end. Thomas Tyson, thank you so much for being with us. Margot Zerpa, thank you. It's great to have you here. Leroy Kincaid, Kate Schneider, fantastic to see you. Olivia Wings Girl, there you are. Scarlet Fire. Najat found an interesting coin with a bat on the back. We'll have to talk about that next time. The Bye, Peter Rabbit, a cult fan. Great to see you out there. Great stuff. Space Ghosts, thank you. It's great to have you out there. And I know that Gigi was out there earlier. Mm-hmm. Great to see you. Gigi's doing excellent videos on her channel now and doing some live shows, which is very, very interesting. And those you don't want to miss, we will be back with you on Friday, and have a safe night out there.
Thanks, everybody.
We talk soon. What song should I quote from at the end here? It's no game.
That's a good one.
Like that.
Although for them, it's all a game.
Documentaries on refugees. Couples against a target.